Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Alison Mims. Viewer discretion is advised. Back in 1987, in the Phoenix, Arizona desert, a horseback rider came across a human body. They were skeletonized remains. The remains had no identity on them, and so police had absolutely no idea who it was. Technology wasn't as advanced back then. We didn't have the DNA technology that we have now, and so these remains were just considered a Jane Doe. They did know that she was a female, but they had no idea who it was. Alison Mims was 19 years old when she was last seen alive by her family back on December 23rd, 1980. She had been attending a family wedding, and she was seen leaving that wedding offering a ride to a man named Patrick Ryan. I cannot find a photo of him literally anywhere, and his last name is spelled R-Y-O-N. Now, Patrick was dating Alison's best friend at the time, and I guess Patrick would eventually marry this woman, but he was the last person to be with her, because after she left that wedding, never seen again. Not once. Now, obviously, there was just speculation running wild of like, well, he was the last one to see her, so he must have done something to her. He denied doing anything. However, years later, he would apparently, allegedly, brag to people that he was responsible for her murder. But a lot of times people say these types of things, even though there's evil things to say, sometimes they say these things in jest. The fact of the matter is that Phoenix police had no evidence that she was dead. They had no body. They had no crime scene. Not one single sign of any kind of foul play. And then fast forwarding 7 years in Phoenix, Arizona, which is my neck of the woods, the skeletal remains were found. It would not be until 2010, however, when they were finally able to identify the remains. This is because Alison's family suspected that those remains might have been hers, and so they just wanted to test their DNA against them. And in fact, they had a match. The remains found in 1987 were Alison. They do not know exactly how she died, but they do know that this was a homicide. That's what they've released. And then from there, I know that Patrick Ryan, who had since divorced Alison's best friend from back then, he was arrested and he was charged with her murder. There is very few details about this case, including a photo of him. I've even tried looking up like Phoenix inmate records and I can't find him. I don't know if you guys will have luck, but it's Patrick R-Y-O-N. I've been searching for like an hour. I don't know if I'm doing it wrong or what, but I can't find him. But Patrick would end up taking a plea deal, essentially admitting guilt. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was only sentenced to 18 years total. He killed a 19-year-old girl. I mean, he wasn't even sentenced for the time that she had actually been alive for. That's insane. I will never understand how this system works. But he will eventually be free. Maybe he was freed and paroled, and that's why I can't find him. I don't know. But how can you kill a person? How can you deliberately murder a human and only get 18 years, a slap on the wrist for doing so? Again, I'll never understand it. So she got justice, but was it truly the justice that she rightfully deserved? Update. The photo of the scumbag from the video this comment comes from has been located. Several of you have sent me DMs or comments to say, hey, we found the photo. And boy, do I feel dumb. So first and foremost, here is the scumbag murderer, Patrick Ryan, or Ryan. That's him. That's the guy. That's the killer from the video that this comment comes from. Take it in, chew it, spit it out if you want to. Probably spit it out. So when I go on and like look for images and stuff, my app defaults to Google Chrome. Even though I have an iPhone and I have Safari, I never use Safari. I always just go to Google Chrome. And so I saw that article that you all have sent to me, and this is what comes up. So the same thing, but I get a blank photo. I get nothing. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. I assumed that these people had maybe somehow taken the photo off. So I was just curious, and so I took the thing and I plugged it into a Safari search thing, and then this is the same article. Boom, with the photo. So, lesson learned for me, I should probably double check on Safari in the future, because for some reason, could not see his photo, did not populate on any search I did on Google Chrome. But on Safari, bada bing, bada boom. Super weird. Don't know if I need to update something or why that happened, but I might use Safari from now on. So thank you all for letting me know. Oh man, are you crazy or what? The jury's still out on that one. Right. No, actually, I'm being serious. The jury is still currently deliberating whether or not I was clinically insane when I went into that Whataburger and decapitated 15 people. You go to Whataburger? Well, I mean, I'm currently banned from going to any of them. They have my picture on the wall. Right. So you're gonna get the death penalty, right? The Brandon Lawson disappearance case has a very unfortunate update. I know many of you know the Brandon Lawson case. He disappeared under very mysterious circumstances way back in 2013. His case has been covered by a lot of true crime people. He disappeared on a dark road while calling 911. He had told 911 that he needed help. And then his brother got involved in trying to get out to where he was, but they never found him. And then a breakthrough came back in February of 2022 when there were human remains discovered somewhat nearby where he had vanished from. And for the longest time, there wasn't any updates on identifying that individual, but apparently an update has finally come. DNA has officially confirmed that the remains found were those of Brandon Lawson. So it is confirmed that Brandon Lawson did pass away, more than likely the night he disappeared. When the remains were found, they were just partial remains and they were, skeletal remains. So his exact cause of death, it doesn't sound like they're really ever going to be able to determine that. He could have died from the elements. He could have died, maybe by some sort of wildlife, an animal. There could be foul play involved. I don't know if how much investigating they're doing into this portion of it. And while it is somber news that they can confirm that he is in fact deceased, at least his family finally can say for sure they have him and they can lay him to rest properly. There is something that you can take from this, especially family members out there who still are missing their loved ones, who have not found them. The journey and the investigation may take a long time, but please always hold out hope that one day you will be able to bring your loved one home. Obviously, preferably alive, but in some capacity, your loved one can be and will be found. 2 gunshots were fired, the gun was found underneath his body, and the army says it was a suicide. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Chad Langford. Viewer discretion is advised. March 12, 1992, 7:40 p.m. At the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama, 20-year-old military patrolman Chad Langford radios into base to state that there was an abandoned vehicle on the side of the road, and he radios for backup. When backup arrives, they find in the middle of the road, this is a recreation, his walkie-talkie, his MP armband, and his military ID, all kind of neatly placed in a pile. A little bit further down the road, they find Chad Langford's patrol car, and lying next to it, Chad Langford. Again, recreation. His cap had been shoved into his mouth. He had a radar cable wrapped around his neck. His ankles were bound with the lanyard for his handgun. His handcuffs had been cuffed to just one of his wrists, and written on his palm was March 3rd and then the name Robert. Underneath his body, completely underneath it, was his service weapon, which was a .45 caliber. They found 2 shell casings, one on the road and one on the driver's seat, but they did not find any bullets, not in Chad or anywhere near the crime scene. They also found 2 buttons on the passenger side of his vehicle, and these buttons were missing from his shirt. Chad Langford at the scene was still unbelievably alive, but unconscious. He was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, they were not able to save him. He would be pronounced deceased, just 4 months shy of his 21st birthday. Chad Langford was born on July 2nd, 1971, and he was actually born and raised in Corpus Christi, Texas. He would be raised by his father and his grandmother. I'm not sure what happened with his mom. Chad did really well in school. He was a star athlete. He was popular. He was well liked. And his dream, his passion, was to join the U.S. Army. And immediately after high school, that's exactly what he did. He enlisted. So what led to this horrific moment? Unbelievably, the Army would rule this a suicide. And they said he shot himself with his own .45 caliber weapon. However, the gun, again, was found completely underneath him. Based on where the bullet entered his body, it would have been physically impossible for that gun to have fallen underneath him. It could not have happened. His gun had been fired twice, but he was only shot once. The army said there was no signs of a struggle, yet the buttons being forcibly ripped off of his shirt would say otherwise. The army tried to state, well, that happened when the paramedics ripped open his shirt. But Chad's body was found basically more towards the back end of the vehicle, and the driver's side door was open. But again, solid objects don't go through solid objects. His dad would actually try to recreate that button scenario over and over and over again. He couldn't make it happen. It would have been physically impossible for those buttons to be ripped off by the paramedics, and not only one fall onto the passenger side of the vehicle, but let alone two? No. And why were his belongings found down the road from where he was found? No sign of a struggle. He had his cap shoved down his throat. He had something wrapped around his neck. His ankles were bound. He had handcuffs on him. Again, his gun was found underneath his body. That cannot happen. Also, they tested his hands apparently, and they were inconclusive for gunshot residue, meaning they really can't determine whether or not he actually shot that gun or not. They would do something called a psychological autopsy. They said that Chad had a history of prior suicide attempts, yet no one in his life could actually confirm that. They said he suffered from major depression, yet again, nobody in his life could state that was actually even true. The army stated he was in such bad mental state because his girlfriend had broken up with him. That wasn't true. His girlfriend, Roxanne, would state she didn't break up with him, he broke up with her. And he was actually happier after the breakup. According to news reports, the army never notified the local police. Despite a member of the army being shot and killed, nobody did a search anywhere on those grounds for his potential shooter. There was no search organized. Why? You're telling me that they saw that scene the way he was found and they said, yep, that's definitely a suicide right from the get-go? I don't buy it. They said, well, he could have staged all of it. Sure, he could have. It's possible. But it's that gun being found underneath his body. That's the thing. That's the biggest thing that he could not possibly have done himself. It's physically impossible. There were rumors that Chad was involved in some kind of undercover operation in the army with regards to drug going-ons in the army. The army would deny that, saying that he had no undercover or narcotics officer roles while in the army. Others say Chad was directly involved with a robbery that went wrong, and somehow that's what led to this entire thing. But again, nobody could find proof of that. However, his family believes that someone had approached him to help with this robbery, but he said no, he refused. And so they silenced Chad so that he wouldn't rat them out. Now, even though the army has denied he had any undercover work, it's not necessarily out of the question that they would say that despite the actual claim being true. And it sounds like his family believes that probably is what led to his death. Some kind of involvement with some kind of undercover operation or some involvement with some drug operation on base. And he was killed in relation to that. That Chad had to be silenced. And to this day, the army, the U.S. military, has not changed his cause of death. It is still ruled a suicide. There was kind of a reopening of the case at one point, and they discovered that on the night that this occurred, all within under a mile from where this happened, 2 different MPs had stopped 2 different vehicles. However, those MPs never wrote down a description of the vehicles and never wrote down the names of the people driving those cars. Those 2 drivers, again not identified officially, were never questioned in relation to Chad's death. There is speculation that one of those men's name is Robert. The name Robert was written in ink on Chad's palm, but that has not been corroborated either in terms of the name of the driver. And despite the army ruling this a suicide and sticking with it, many believe he was murdered. And honestly, that's what it sounds like. However, this could have been a very methodical way of him doing it to himself. But again, the gun. And so to most outside the army, Chad Langford's death remains an unsolved mystery. 2 men have very recently vanished from Mission Viejo, California. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Chandler Sykes and Brandon Blackthorne. Viewer discretion is advised. Chandler Sykes is 29 years old from Mission Viejo, California. On December 22nd, 2024, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, Chandler called his mom to ask to order him an Uber. And the Uber was going to be picking him up from his girlfriend's house to bring him home. At 6:46 a.m., the Uber driver picked him up in a black Tesla vehicle, and this was on Silver Lantern Road in Dana Point, California specifically. According to Uber's records, he arrived at his destination at 7:02 a.m. The destination was on Zancon Road. However, there is no evidence, or nobody really knows if he actually entered the residence or not. But he has not been seen or heard from ever since that moment. He just seemed to fall off the face of the earth, just absolutely out of nowhere. Chandler is 5'10", approximately 160 pounds, with light brown hair and blue-green eyes. If you have any information on his whereabouts, please call 714-647-7000. Please, if you know anything, please help his family get him home. 30-year-old Brandon Blackthorne is also from Mission Viejo, California. He was last seen on December 23rd, 2024, so just a day after Chandler. He left his home. He was wearing his red polo shirt, white shorts with blue and red stripes, and oddly enough, he actually got into a Tesla vehicle, his own vehicle. It was a gray 2016 Tesla X model. And from that point moving forward, nobody has seen him since. Anybody with information on his whereabouts is asked to call 714-647-7000. There is a question, are these two cases related? Well, in a bit of a kind of a twist here. So while Chandler was last seen on December 22nd, they received communication from him on December 23rd at approximately 11:30 p.m. The last time Brandon was seen was him leaving his home on December 23rd at approximately 11:30 p.m. I don't know if it's the same Tesla involved in both situations. I have to imagine they would have checked those Uber records and made that kind of connection, and I don't see any mention of police actually saying that there is a connection here at all. I have seen rumors on Facebook and stuff with regards to how the two men may be connected, but I don't want to sit here and spread any kind of misinformation on this. So I would invite you to kind of do your own looking into that. And I don't want to speculate or anything, since these two men have gone missing very, very recently around the same time from the same area. I don't want to hinder anything. It could be just an absolute coincidence that he was last seen getting into a Tesla and he drove a Tesla. And some people may ask, okay, so he was last confirmed seen on December 22nd, but then there was a communication almost a full day later. He's 29 years old. I mean, he's a full-grown adult. It's not like, they're going to say oh my God, you need to come home right away, reporting him missing. The family had to kind of exhaust any kind of looking into this first before they reported him missing. So again, it can be just completely unrelated. But again, if you have any information, please reach out to police. Two men have very recently vanished from Mission Viejo, California. There is a very unfortunate update in this case. Chandler Sykes' mom just informed me that both Chandler and Brandon have been found, and tragically they have been found deceased. They were found together in the same vehicle, and they were found submerged in water. There was some sort of automobile accident that led to this happening. They were literally just found. There's not a whole lot of information out yet. I just wanted to quickly make this video just to, let people know, and to Chandler's mom, to his family, to Brandon's family, you have my condolences. I am incredibly sorry that this was the outcome. I just want to make sure that you guys in the comment section, please just be respectful. Please do not speculate or spread rumors or gossip. Let facts speak for themselves when they come out. But again, to both families, you have my condolences. He tried to recreate 9/11. Thank goodness he failed. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Charles Bishop. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles J. Bishop was a 15-year-old child when this occurred. He was a high school student at East Lake High School in Tampa, Florida. And at this time, he was also getting flying lessons. It was January 5th, 2002. He was due for a flying lesson that day in I'm probably going to say this wrong, but a Cessna 172. This one. And at 5 p.m. that day, his flight instructor had walked away from him while Charles was in the plane. The flight instructor was just going to be doing a very basic pre-flight checklist. When the instructor walked away from the plane, Charles started the plane up and began to take it to the runway. He did all of this without permission, and he took off. He was now in the air. Almost immediately, the United States Coast Guard was alerted of this, and they dispatched a helicopter. But it was too late. This is the Bank of America building in Tampa, Florida. Charles J. Bishop, a 15-year-old kid who had just stolen a plane, who showed no signs of moving away from any building, flew head-on into the building. And the plane crashed somewhere around the 28th or 29th floor. Obviously, this gave quite a shock to everyone because, 9/11 had just happened. However, in this instance, there was only one fatality. Charles Bishop. He died on impact. What was the most alarming was that in the wreckage, they found a burnt note written by Charles. The note read, quote, "I have prepared this statement in regards to the acts I'm about to commit. First of all, Osama bin Laden is absolutely justified in the terror he has caused on 9/11. He has brought a mighty nation to its knees. God blesses him and the others who helped make September 11th happen. The U.S. will have to face the consequences for its horrific actions against the Palestinian people and Iraqis by its allegiance with the monstrous Israelis, who want nothing short of world domination. You will pay. God help you, and I will make you pay. There will be more coming. Al-Qaeda and other organizations have met with me several times to discuss the option of me joining, but I didn't. This is an operation done by me only. I had no other help, although I am acting on their behalf." End quote. His goal was to create more terror. He wanted to try to recreate 9/11. In the investigation, they also discovered that he actually came really, really close to crashing into a commercial jetliner, which thankfully he didn't, because that would have obviously caused a lot more tragedy. The incident would obviously create new procedures, new rules for flight schools, especially with regards to minors. It doesn't sound like the flight instructor got any kind of, didn't get in trouble or anything, but they did blame this on a misuse of trust. Charles' mom at one point tried to sue the manufacturers of a certain acne medication. I think it's called Accutane. She found out that this medication can cause severe depression and suicidal thoughts, but on 2007, she dropped the suit altogether. Investigators did not find any direct connection between Charles and any terrorist organization, meaning he had not actually met with any of them or there was no communications that they found between him and them. However, it is clear that he was inspired by 9/11 and wanted to recreate the events. But this was all the damage he could do, thankfully. And no one else got killed. There were, I think, a couple injuries, but everyone was fine. The only one who died was Charles. And honestly, it's kind of hard to feel sorry, because this was a deliberate act, trying to create more death and tragedy. So I don't have any sympathy.
Please hurry. Is there somebody in the house with you?
Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Colin Ridgway. Viewer discretion is advised. Colin Ridgway and his wife, Joan Jackson, lived here in this home at University Park, Texas. On the evening of May 13th, 1993, Joan Jackson makes that 911 call you just heard. And if you're wondering why her voice sounds a little bit different, it's because she had gotten into some kind of automobile accident years prior to this, and it damaged her throat. But she had walked into her home and discovered her husband, Colin, was dead. He had been shot numerous times. Colin and Joan had married in the late 70s. Colin was actually originally from Australia. And the reason why he was in the States is because he had signed as an undrafted free agent for the Dallas Cowboys. He became the first Australian to ever be on an NFL team. However, it doesn't sound like he ever actually played a professional game in the NFL, but he did play on their preseason team. But by 1966, the Dallas Cowboys, at his request, would release him. Colin then goes on to marry Joan Jackson, and they have a very back and forth, tumultuous relationship. It was good, then it was bad, then it was good, then it was bad. And then, on that May 13th, 1993 evening, it all ended. Colin and Joan had gone out that evening, and they went in separate cars. They then drove back to their home, and they arrived back at their house pretty much at the same time. Colin pulls his car into the front driveway of the home. He enters through the front door, and he begins to walk upstairs. Joan, however, takes her car. This is something that she normally did, and she pulled it, I guess, down a side path. She then gets out of her car and begins to water the plants in the backyard. Now, she says she doesn't hear anything, but then Joan enters the home probably 10, 15 minutes later, and she makes this 911 call.
Please hurry. Is there somebody in the house with you? My bedroom's torn up, and he's on the floor.
Joan's husband of 15 years, Colin Ridgway, was dead. He had been shot numerous times. Joan again says she did not hear the gunshots, and he had been shot, I believe, 7 or 8 times. The bedroom he was in disarray. A bunch of their personal files and stuff seemed to be thrown out all over the floor. Now, there were rumors, I guess, that the night or two prior to this happening, Colin had said he was planning on divorcing Joan. How truthful or accurate that is, I'm not 100% sure. But some looked at that as a potential motive for Joan herself to kill Colin, because she would benefit from it financially. However, police never found any evidence, nothing at all, to suggest that she was a guilty party in this. But they did also think, well, maybe she was a part of this, but was it a murder for hire thing? Now, I can't find a confirmed younger photo of the man, but this is a man named Kenneth Bicking. He came up in their investigation as a possible link for this murder for hire plot. I guess they found some kind of connection between him and Joan. Now, he didn't actually live in Texas, but what police would eventually find out is that Mr. Bicking was actually in University Park, Texas that particular night. And there was a financial link between him and Joan. So actually there was a point where they arrested him based on circumstantial evidence only. However, they had to soon release him and drop charges because there was not a single ounce of physical evidence connecting him to the murder. There was no physical evidence connecting Joan to the murder. But police firmly believed that he was involved in the murder. They just sadly did not have the proof. I know that later on he would be arrested for rape charges and he would have to give over his DNA. He had been convicted of other violent crimes in the years after the murder. So in 2011, they would test evidence from the crime scene, evidence that had not been tested yet. And apparently they did find some DNA profiles that were not Colin's, but also those DNA profiles found with the evidence did not match Kenneth Bicking either at all, nor did it match Joan. Joan had gone on the news several times after the murder happened, and she had to constantly say that she was innocent, that she didn't do this. But we all know that in the true crime world, it's typically the wife who does it or the husband who does it, depending on the victim. And more often than not, it's either because of love or because of money, or sometimes both. Now, apparently, and I don't know the individual's name, but there was somebody living, because the house they lived in was like a duplex-style home. And I guess there was someone who lived on the bottom floor because they lived on the top floor, Colin and Joan. So the downstairs neighbor was interviewed and he said, or she said, I'm not sure, did not hear anything at all. No altercation, no screaming, no gunshots. None of the neighbors heard anything either. No gunshots or anything. But they do know he was shot. It's just strange that nobody, especially the people in the house or just outside of it, didn't hear it. Could they have used a silencer? Maybe. But it sounds like, if the wife wasn't involved at all, it sounds like this killer was already in the house waiting for him, waiting for Colin, hiding in the shadows, because he was attacked within minutes of getting home. And then the killer fled the scene, not seen by Joan or any neighbors or the downstairs resident. It's all very strange, convenient for the killer, if you will. But maybe this was a very professional person. Maybe he was killed for other reasons. Unfortunately, police don't really know the motive because nothing was stolen. Was this a murder for hire plot by Joan? They don't know. Did this Kenneth person kill him on his own without the assistance of anyone else? They don't know. They don't know why he would either. The sad truth is they just don't know. By all accounts, Colin was a good dude. He was a happy guy. He was well loved by his friends and family. And somebody took him away from all of them. And that person has gotten away with it. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Colin Ridgway. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the unsolved murder of Colin Ridgway in Texas in 1993, please call 214-363-3000. This is the last known image of a young woman, and she has never been seen since. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Cortney Lake. Viewer discretion is advised. Cortney, pictured here as a young child with her brother, she grew up in Newfoundland in Canada. But at the time of this case, Cortney Lake was 24 years old and she was a mother. Cortney was at this time no longer involved with the father of her child. And she had just gotten out of a very abusive relationship with this man here, Philip Smith. He was physically and emotionally abusive to Cortney, and she definitely tried to get help. Cortney had emergency protection orders and peace bonds against him, and he was court-ordered not to be in contact with her. Well, one day, I guess he takes Cortney's belongings, puts them on the front yard, and sets them on fire. He ends up going to jail, and then when he gets out, he contacts Cortney's mother, Lisa, and basically says to her that he's going to end his own life. And she, despite the horrible stuff he's done to Cortney, she does not want him to die, and so she calls his sister. And eventually, basically, this prevents him ending his life. And in a tragic turn of events, she wishes she never took that call. She wishes she never called Philip's sister, because if she hadn't, Cortney would still be here, and Philip would not. It was June 7th, 2017. Cortney had gotten into contact with Philip because he said he still had some of her favorite Christmas ornaments. Those are some of the things he didn't burn or destroy. And she agreed to meet him to get those ornaments. Later on in this investigation, CCTV footage will be released to the public showing Cortney walking down this road. And just before 8 p.m. that night, she is seen getting into the passenger side of a GMC pickup truck. And Cortney from here has never been seen again. She would be reported missing pretty quickly, just given the circumstances of her meeting up with Philip. Now, I know a lot of the public had insinuated that maybe the father of her child was somehow involved in what happened to her, whatever that may be. And I know that he has recently, in the past few years, been the target of certain attacks, like people had set his cars on fire, because there was this public perception that he had done something to her, but he didn't do anything to her. He's not the guilty party here. On June 27th, police would go to Cortney's mom's house, Lisa's house, and they sat her down and told her that we no longer think she is a missing person. They said to her, Cortney has been murdered. And Lisa looks at the officer and says, so who did it? And they say back to her, quote, I can't release to you who did it, but this person had court orders to stay away from her. And then Lisa just says back to the officer, Philip Smith, God damn you. Now, he was not arrested or charged with murder or anything because they did not have Cortney anywhere. They didn't have the physical evidence to present at that time that he had done something to her. On November 1st, 2017, Lisa gets another visit from the police. They sit her down and they tell her Philip Smith is dead. Philip had been found in these woods and he had ended his own life, something he had wanted to do several months prior to Cortney's disappearance. They know he did something to her. They just don't know what or where she is. And all of those secrets went to the grave with him. Philip did not leave a note. He didn't tell anybody his plans. No text messages, no emails, nothing. He took the secrets of what he did to Cortney to the grave. But the family believes, and I believe this too because it's pretty much always the case, that Philip likely at least told one or two other people, that somebody else knows what he did with her and where he put her. And here's the thing, he's dead now. He can't harm you, he can't harm anyone you love. So if you know, you have got to come forward. The family just wants her back. Her son is growing up without a mother. Someone lost their daughter. Someone lost their sister, their niece. Cortney Lake was a human being who was just, God knows what happened to her. So if you have any information on where she is, just help bring her home. You can report your information anonymously if you have to. If you have any information, please call 1-800-222-8477. A young woman found dead inside her apartment. The police say it was natural causes. The boyfriend says it was murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Crystal Spencer. Viewer discretion is advised. Crystal Spencer was born on September 4th, 1959. She was one of 3 kids. By her teenage years, her parents had separated, and so it was just her mom raising all 3 kids. So by age 17, Crystal drops out of high school in order to get a job to help with her mom. But ultimately, her goal in life was Hollywood. She wanted to make it big. She wanted to be a star. Now, she was born and raised in Ukiah, California, but by the time this case happens, she had moved down to Hollywood, specifically like in the Burbank, California area. Crystal was able to get a couple like small gigs here and there, but her journey to stardom was just, it was not going smoothly. So she would take on jobs, which would include her working as a stripper. Something she didn't like to do, but she knows she needed to make money. Around that time, she met this man here named Anton. The 2 of them began to talk, and they quickly hit it off, and they became a couple. And by all accounts, the 2 of them were madly in love with each other. He was great to her, and she loved him. By 1988 or so, Crystal, who's now 28 years old, would tell everyone that she was going to be accepting a job working in Japan as an exotic dancer. This would be like a 3-month gig, and by all accounts, she was really, really happy and excited for it. But sometime shortly before she was supposed to leave, something horrible happened. The last time Anton saw her, Crystal was sick with a minor cold, and it had been about 2 or 3 days since he had heard from her. He last spoke to her on May 5th, 1988. But then after he hadn't heard from her for a few days, he goes to her apartment, knocks on the door, there's no answer, he calls, no answer. He goes to her place of work. He finds out she hasn't been there for days. He finds out that I guess someone who worked at the apartment complex Crystal lived at, this landlord person said, oh yeah, I think she left for Japan already. But that was not the case. About a week or so later, Anton gets a call from the Burbank police stating that Crystal was found dead in her apartment. They say she died of natural causes. There was no foul play, no gunshots, no stab wounds, no strangulation, no asphyxia. The coroner determined that she had no drugs and no alcohol in her system. But she was so badly decomposed that they could not determine her actual cause of death. The coroner would label it undetermined. But eventually the police would say that she just died of natural causes, case closed. But Anton found discrepancies in the autopsy report. The autopsy report said that this person was 5'7". Crystal was barely 5 foot. The autopsy report said that this person was 140 pounds. Crystal was only about 100 pounds. All confirmed by medical records. So they began to believe, was this even Crystal? Well, they took her fingerprints and determined that it was Crystal. So how were they so wrong on so many things? Anton found out that when she was found in the apartment, she was huddled in a corner with a cord wrapped around her, like a phone cord. Not wrapped around her throat or anything, she was just kind of like tangled in it. And she was nude from the waist down. A week after her body was found, her neighbors, wow, that is some hair. Well, they would tell police that around the time that Crystal would have likely died, they heard the sounds of extreme moaning, screaming, and the sounds of what sounded like possibly someone being tortured. It was a female coming from somewhere nearby. They think it was Crystal's apartment. Other people said that they thought they heard someone like violently ill, but police, I guess, didn't really take their claim seriously. And the police once again says, yeah, it was just natural causes. Okay, but what? Heart attack? What happened? We don't know. And then the police end up closing the case altogether, saying it was, quote, death by probable natural causes. Anton calls him and says, what the hell? And according to Anton, one of the officers he would speak to after the case was closed said, quote, bad things happen to bad girls, end quote. And Anton was like, do you mean bad girls just die of natural causes? A healthy 28-year-old woman who just had a cold? And the police officer he spoke to then responded with, you know exactly what I mean. What does that mean? Anton believes this entire investigation was completely fucked up. They screwed up from the beginning. There was no crime scene photos. They never treated her death as suspicious. They never found out exactly what killed her. No drugs, no alcohol whatsoever was in her system. There's no overdose. Anton suspects it could have been someone from one of the strip clubs she worked at. Maybe a fanatic followed her home. She wasn't sexually assaulted, at least not that anyone really knows. Apparently, the owner of a strip club, or several strip clubs in the area, including the one that Crystal worked at, he was a former California highway patrolman. And Anton suspects that perhaps he had something to do with her death, and that might be why the police are like, man, natural causes, go away. This California Highway Patrol officer, this former one, also ran illegal gambling things. And there was speculation that Crystal found out and was working with the FBI to get this guy. Many years later, they would find out that the FBI actually had a file on Crystal Spencer with regards to the investigation into this former officer. His name was Horace McKenna. Horace dies in an accident in 1989. And ultimately, if Crystal Spencer was murdered, well, the police just don't seem to care. The investigation has never been reopened. She was cremated, so they can't do another autopsy. And all they have is that really poorly written, shitty autopsy report from the original one. And without any crime scene photos, without any evidence, if Crystal Spencer was murdered, her killer got away with it. 100%. He will never be arrested. Unless somebody comes forward. Unless somebody somewhere out there knows the truth. And perhaps that killer is still alive. You can report your information anonymously. You don't have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. If you have any information on the death of Crystal Spencer, please call 818-238-3000. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of David Alexander. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred way back in 1985 in the Indiana County area of Pennsylvania. At the time of this case, David Alexander was 34 years old, and he had just married his wife Pauline about 4 months or so before this case occurred. On the night of September 16th, 1985, David would go out to a bar to watch the Pittsburgh Steelers game. It was Monday Night Football, something he absolutely loved to watch. After the game was over, he left the bar, but he never got home. The reason why he never got home is because he was dead. The bullet-ridden body of David Alexander was found near a pond in the Black Lake Township area. He had been shot at least 3 times, and it was ruled immediately a homicide. One thing important to note is that David Alexander was actually working as an informant for the police, specifically with the Pennsylvania State Police Drug Task Force, something they have not denied. They have confirmed he was an informant. Pauline can recall that at David's funeral, there was an officer there who promised her, we'll have this guy off the streets very soon, almost implying they think they know who did it. Pauline says she knows who did this. Now, the only name I could find is he's just described as a guy named Jerry. I don't know if that's his real name, and I don't know his last name. But I guess there was a time when David's mom would actually write the suspect's name across her car and drive around town. Pauline has given police, I think this is the guy, you need to look into this guy. But here we are in 2025, his case remains unsolved. Pauline, now getting close to her 80s, is still looking for justice for David. And it's the same person's name, she says over and over again, that she knows did this. But why are police not arresting anyone? Well, simply put, there's possible corruption, especially since David was involved with the drug task force. And the guy that she believes shot and killed her husband is just walking the streets. He's still saying hello to everybody. He actually has given Pauline a hug from time to time. Some residents talk to this guy and say openly, "Hey, you kill anyone lately?" Another woman recounts that she saw the suspect in the bar she worked at and she spit in his food. So it sounds like whoever this Jerry person is, it sounds like everybody believes that this guy did it, but why are police not arresting him? And again, it's alleged corruption, which goes all the way up to the top. There were reports that they alleged that there was mishandling of evidence. Pauline said that they had taken his fingernail clippings and they found DNA underneath them, but that DNA has never matched anyone. You see, apparently this Jerry person is not just a regular guy. He was quite literally a top head honcho drug lord, which may have included some of his clients or customers, people within the police department or the judicial system there. This suspect, this drug lord, had allegedly murdered his own brother because he believed that his brother stole coke from him. And so a person like that might be intertwined with the politics, if you will, of this community. And maybe that's why they're being protected. But again, it's all allegedly. None of this has been officially confirmed. And again, the suspect's name has never, to my knowledge that I can see, ever been publicly said. I mean, not recently, in articles or anything like that. But Pauline is still fighting for justice for her husband. He was very likely killed over something to do with drugs in this community. Him being an informant. And usually if someone is found out to be an informant, well, it's not going to be so safe for them. And it sounds like He's right there. Sounds like, hey, this is the guy, but no one's doing anything. And maybe that's because people are afraid to come forward, understandably so. I get it. But if you know something, you can report information anonymously. You know, I would say contact the police, but is that the best place to go for this one? This is decades later, and all the people involved back then are no longer technically involved now. You have like new fresh faces on this. Hopefully not corrupt individuals. So, if you have information about the murder of David Alexander from 1985, please contact the local police at 724-357-1975 or 1-800-4PA-TIPS. Please help David get the justice he very rightfully deserves. A young woman would be found discarded off the side of the road, and tire tracks and DNA would help find the killer. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Dawn Birnbaum. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Dawn Marie Birnbaum was just 17 years old. She was a happy-go-lucky kid. She had a big personality. But she also did have some behavioral issues, and so her mom would put her in like a boarding school type place to kind of help, tamper the behavior issues. At her heart, it sounds like she was a good person who, like many teenagers, just had some troubles with their behavior. That's it. So the boarding school was in Bangor, Maine. On March 21st, 1993, Dawn would just pick up and run away from the boarding school. 3 days later, a man is driving down the road. This is a recreation, and this is in Pennsylvania. The body of a young woman is found dumped off the side of the road. The young woman did not have any identification on her. She was nude from the waist down, and she had nylon rope tied around her throat, and also her wrists. The coroner would determine that this young woman died of strangulation, and she was also sexually assaulted. They found a strand of dark hair underneath one of the ropes. They found another string of dark hair elsewhere on her body. They were not her hair. On her palm, they also found the remnants of something written, like a phone number. When they kind of examined it, they would see that she had written in pen someone's number. And it sounds like there were possibly 2 different phone numbers written. And along with this phone number, they tried calling it, and a photo that they were circulating of this young woman's face. They would finally get a break in the case to identify who she was. So the phone number would link back to, I believe, the boarding school that Dawn was in. And when they showed a photo of the victim to one of the counselors there at the boarding school, the counselors identified that woman as Dawn. So now they had a face to the name of the victim. 17-year-old Dawn Birnbaum was the victim found sexually assaulted and strangled and partially clothed off the side of the road. So they know that Dawn would frequent truck stops and basically take rides with truckers. So they had a hunch to basically go to every truck stop and gas station along the route from where she was last seen in Bangor, Maine, to where she was found in Pennsylvania. And through that, they were getting receipts for like gas purchases from multiple gas stations along that path. They wanted to see if there was any similar names from Maine and also from Pennsylvania. And they caught a humongous break. There was one and only one person who got gas at both locations during the time frame when this murder would have happened. A man named James Robert Cruz. That's the signature right there. He was, in fact, a truck driver. He lived in Ohio, and he had a wife and a daughter. Now, next to Dawn's body, they found tire tracks that were leading away from where her body was found. And the tire tracks they found there were definitely not from a normal car. They were from a semi or some sort of very large truck. So they found the truck that James Robert Cruz was driving, and they compared the tire tracks from his truck to the tire tracks found near the body. It was a match. So this was able to get them a warrant to thoroughly search the truck that he was driving, and they found a strand of hair in his truck that was not his. It was a long blonde hair, which would be Dawn. And so they ran a match, and in fact, the hair found in his semi-truck was Dawn Birnbaum's. And that was able to get them a warrant to take a blood sample from Mr. Cruz. Because she was sexually assaulted, they had male bodily fluid. And with a 660 million to 1 match, the DNA found with her matched James Robert Cruz. And Don was not the only person police suspected he had murdered. There was a string of murders of sex workers in the area. Dawn was not a sex worker, so she didn't necessarily fit that profile. But they still had this suspicion that he was involved in way many more deaths than just one. However, they never had any physical evidence to actually connect him directly to those murders. Those murders remain unsolved. But they do firmly believe he was probably the man responsible for them, but they can't say for sure. James Robert Cruz would go on trial for the murder of Don Birnbaum. They had DNA evidence from his bodily fluid found with her. They had her hair in his truck. They had his hair on her body. They also had the gas receipts to prove that he was directly in the area when Dawn disappeared, and he was in the area where her body was dumped. One interesting little side note to this is that the prosecutor who prosecuted this case was a man named Ray Grecar. I covered Ray Grecar's case a long time ago, but he was the prosecutor who just one day vanished in 2005. There's been no sign of him ever since. I have covered, I think, one or two other cases where there is some sort of connection to Ray Grecar. Now, the reason why so he was convicted, right, of Dawn's murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. There were some attempts for him to get appeals, but he was denied. So in those years that he was trying to get appeals, you had Ray Grecar, who vanished mysteriously, and other people connected to the case had died. Not necessarily through foul play means, but had just, died. So there is kind of like that lingering suspicion. Was, he working to kind of eliminate witnesses, get rid of the prosecutor who tried his case? It's really not known. It's really more just a conspiracy theory, really. But that being said, they do believe that James Cruz was responsible for more than just one death. They just can't prove it. But luckily, the man will be behind bars for the remainder of his natural life. He will never breathe free air again. They say this house is haunted, possibly by the woman who was murdered inside of it. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Bembridge house murder. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, unfortunately, I do not have a confirmed photo of the victim. I found one photo that I was not sure if it was her or not, so I'm not going to use it. But Dorothy Bembridge lived here in this house. It would later be called the Bembridge House, and it's located in Long Beach, California. The house was built in 1906. Inside the home is 18 different rooms. It's a Victorian mansion style. And the house to this day is still perfectly preserved, including most of the original furnishings inside. The original owner of the house died in 1918. It was bought by a man named Thomas Rankin, who one of his children was Dorothy Bembridge. So Dorothy lived in this house her entire life. Dorothy was a beloved woman. She was a musician. She had been a school teacher for a long portion of her adult life, but she retired in 1968. Dorothy would explain to people that the interior of the home had never been renovated. So it was in its original pristine condition. But by 1969, I guess the officials in Long Beach threatened to demolish the home. And Dorothy, working along historical societies, worked very, very hard to have the house preserved as a music center and basically become a landmark. And the battle was won by Dorothy. In 1990, while Dorothy was still obviously living there, a man named Daniel Barunda had broke into the home and burglarized it. He had been caught for the burglary and was charged, and he was convicted of it. He was released in 1999. Just a couple of weeks after he was released from prison, an absolutely horrific discovery was made inside the Bembridge house. Actually, specifically the backyard of the house. The 89-year-old woman, Dorothy Bembridge, was found dead in the backyard. She had been strangled to death. Through about an 18-month or so investigation, police would come to the conclusion that Daniel Barunda, the man who had burglarized her home before and was convicted of it, came back to get revenge on her. Just weeks after he was released from prison, he went into the home to burglarize it, found her in it, and killed her. So Daniel Barunda was convicted of her murder, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He was 51 years old at the time of the murder, so basically he's the rest of his life in prison. After Dorothy's unfortunate death in the year 2000, Long Beach Heritage purchased the Bembridge home. It was maintained to its original state, and it began to open its doors to start tours. There is a history of hauntings that have occurred inside the home. Some people believe that Dorothy, who again was murdered there, roams the halls. Not necessarily a malevolent spirit, just a very calm, benevolent one. But one of the original people who lived in the home before Dorothy and her family had ended their own life inside the house. It was a sudden tragedy. And so there are also sightings of this potential spirit roaming the halls of the home. Something to also note, not too far away, also in Long Beach, is the Queen Mary, a now permanently docked luxury liner that is also considered one of the most haunted locations on Earth. I had been there several times to the Queen Mary myself, and I would love to go back and stay on it. But I had never even heard of the Bembridge house before I left California. But honestly, I would love to tour it, not necessarily for the ghost aspect, just for like the Victorian mansion aspect. I love going into these really old places like this. And a lot for what it sounds like for the Bembridge house is that Dorothy fought like hell to make sure this house remained intact and stayed the way it always had been. She poured her heart and soul into this house. You know, it was owned by her father before her. And she probably imagined that she would die, you know, living in this home, but unfortunately not in the way her life actually ended. But thankfully, the Heritage Foundation there in Long Beach has kept Dorothy's and the Bembridge house's legacy alive. Within moments of this video being taken, the man featured in the video would die in one of the worst deaths imaginable. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 28-year-old Jacob Cockle. Jacob was an adventurer who lived in the United Kingdom. He was at times a bit of a daredevil, an avid surfer, and he was an award-winning photographer. This is one of the coolest photos I've seen. From a very early age, Jacob was obsessed with the water. The water is where he felt most at peace. And he learned to surf from a very early age. He received accolades from National Geographic. And shortly before this story happened, he actually won a trip, an expedition to Antarctica. But sadly, he would not be able to take that voyage. It was in 2013 at Hale Harbor in Cornwall, United Kingdom. Jacob wanted to record himself doing another daredevil routine. And yes, there were warnings posted there to not go swimming. I guess this was an area that had whirlpools, which are basically like underwater tornadoes. And swimming near one of these things is incredibly dangerous because these things can just suck you right in and you could just drown. But Jacob, being the daredevil, he jumped into the water and began to swim around this whirlpool as his friend recorded. The video of this is like 7 or 8 minutes long, and especially towards the end, you can hear the friend essentially telling Jacob, I think we have enough footage, you know, kind of trying to like say, hey, I think we're good. You know, maybe let's reel it in.
I mean, the light's nice across the water as well. Let me get down lower.
People walking by must just be like, what is going on? Well, I never.
There's a fisherman over there who's probably going to try and catch you.
I don't know what the deal is with the horse head. I'm not sure what that is about.
Right.
But anyway, you can see that he was literally just circling the edge of this whirlpool. You can also see video taken from the GoPro that he had on at one point from the kind of the outside of this whirlpool. And this is like when it was at its smallest, because it actually seems to get bigger. But Jacob wanted to do one last very daring stunt. Obviously, it goes without saying, you should never, ever, ever try any of this if you ever see one of these things. Stay very clear away from them. But he decided to put on the GoPro and dive directly into the whirlpool. He wanted to have footage from what it would look like inside of one. This is that footage. And that was it. His friend would call out to him asking for him to come back up, but Jacob never did. And eventually, Jacob's body had resurfaced just a few short feet away. Not really knowing how deep this whirlpool was, he dove basically right into the middle of it, and the vortex had sucked him completely under, and it just took him, and it continued to spin him around basically. And he does not have any breathing apparatus on him. He only has on his wetsuit. And I was reading one article that said that a wetsuit might actually help the whirlpool drag him under because of air pockets, I guess, that happens within the wetsuit. But because he had no breathing apparatus, he had no tanks or anything, he couldn't swim to the surface, Jacob would end up drowning in the whirlpool. And when it finally stopped, his body would resurface basically over in this area. Jacob Cockle lived by the sea. He lived for the sea. And ultimately it was the sea that took him. But, this was Jacob's life. In the end, he died doing what he was passionate about. He died doing what he loved. He died where he felt most comfortable. But at the same time, this is something that nobody should ever, ever, ever try to do, because it can very easily cost you your life. A pastor would destroy his family because of an affair and for money. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Elizabeth Sennett. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles Sennett, who was a pastor, would marry his wife Elizabeth in 1962. Elizabeth was a devoted wife, and then soon she would become a loving and devoted mother to 2 young boys. She was the best mom they could possibly ask for. She loved her 2 boys more than anything on this earth. Elizabeth was just a very cherished person. No one could really ever say anything bad against her. She was sweet, she was loving, she was kind, and she certainly did not deserve what came to her. Her husband Charles, a pastor, would end up having an extramarital affair. This was with a member of his own congregation. He was also falling into financial despair. And so what he would end up doing is he would take out, you guessed it, a life insurance policy on his wife Elizabeth. And so Charles decided that the mother of his 2 children needed to die. But Charles, he couldn't do it himself, of course, so he hired someone. He contacted a friend of his named Billy Gray Williams to either kill his wife or hire someone to kill his wife. And that's what Billy Gray Williams did. Billy Gray Williams hired this man, Kenneth Eugene Smith, and he was asked to murder Elizabeth Sennett. Then Kenneth decides he needs to hire someone else to assist him. He contacts one person, but they say absolutely the fuck not. But then he contacts this man, John Forrest Parker, and he agrees to help murder Elizabeth. The 2 of them at one point would try to claim to police and lawyers that they didn't know they were supposed to kill her. They thought they were just supposed to initially hurt her and scare her. But that certainly is not what actually occurred. On March 18th, 1988, Charles Sennett would go to his church and he would lead service. Elizabeth was not there at the service that day with him. So while he was at church, Elizabeth was home alone because their 2 children were now adults. These 2 men knock on her door and state that her husband Charles had hired them to do some work around the house, and so they were just there to tell her that. And then she said, well, let me call my husband first. So she calls the church, and he confirms, yeah, let them in and let them go around the property. And I guess that's what they end up doing. But then they end up knocking on the door again and ask if they could use her restroom and get some water. And because her husband had already vouched for them to her, she said yes. While one of them went to the bathroom, the other one stayed in the living room area and just conversated with Elizabeth. That's when John Parker approaches her from behind and beats her over her head. And then a vicious beating occurred. These 2 men would take anything they could find in the area that this was happening and use it as a weapon. They used every piece of a fireplace set to beat her. They found a walking cane to beat her with. They found a piece of galvanized pipe that they then beat her with. Then, using a survival knife that one of them had, they stabbed her 8 times. And they were told to make this look like a robbery, and so they stole a VCR and a stereo. However, Elizabeth's purse with a whole bunch of money in it was just sitting there out in the open, clear for them to see, but they didn't take that. A little bit later, Charles enters the home and finds his wife brutally murdered. And he calls 911 to report the crime. When, rescuers arrived, Elizabeth had already she was dead. This was an absolutely horrific crime to a lovely, incredible woman who just wanted to have a family, and she was such a staple in this community. Everybody loved her. And within a week of her murder, all eyes pointed to Charles. You know, they found evidence of the life insurance policy that he had taken out conveniently just shortly before her murder. And so the investigation was pointing towards him. So within a week or two of her murder, Charles ends his own life. He took the coward's way out. Instead of facing justice for what he organized, he said, screw it, I'm just gonna die. But through their investigation into him, they uncovered the identities of these two men. They found out that both of these men were each paid, I shit you not, $1,000. Billy Williams, who hired one of these men, who then hired the other one, was also paid $1,000. $1,000 to take the life of a mother. That's all it took for them. $1,000. Unbelievable. Billy Williams, John Parker, and Kenneth Smith were all arrested and charged with their various parts of this crime. Billy Williams was sentenced to life in prison for organizing the murder. Kenneth Smith and John Parker were both found guilty of committing the murder and were both sentenced to death. In 2010, John Forrest Parker was executed. And in January of 2024, Kenneth Smith was also executed. All of this because a man had cheated on his wife and needed some money. And the other three men involved, all they needed was $1,000 to completely destroy a family, to separate a mother from her two children. But at least she got the justice she very rightfully deserved. This is the last known image of a woman who has been missing since just before Christmas. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Eugenia Cooley. Viewer discretion is advised. Eugenia Harris Cooley lived here in this apartment building, and that is in Maysville, Kentucky. The 47-year-old mother and grandmother had been living in Maysville for about a year or so. And despite living about an hour or so away from her kids and her grandkids, she always kept in very close contact with them. Eugenia was always texting, she's always calling, and there was no indications from the last time that her family saw her that she was in any kind of despair. She had zero history of any mental health issues. She had not been dating anyone that anyone was aware of. She had not been in any kind of trouble. The last time she contacted any of her family was on December 19th, 2024. She texted them, quote, "I love all my children. I miss you. I love you." One of her daughters texted her back, and she never got a response. No one has heard from her ever again. When Christmas came and went, they hadn't heard from her. They became extremely concerned, and so her kids drove the hour down to Maysville to check on her. When they got to her apartment in Maysville, they noticed that her door was unlocked. It wasn't open, but it was unlocked, which was unusual. Eugenia's keys were hanging, I guess, from a lanyard on her bedroom doorknob, and they found a duffel bag that had Eugenia's wallet in it. But again, Eugenia is nowhere to be found. They arrived at her apartment on New Year's Eve, and they stayed there that night in hopes that maybe she would come home, but she did not. So they would end up reporting her missing. One of the most unusual aspects of this was what was in her trash can just outside of her apartment. There were a couple of bags full of stuff. Her cell phone was stuffed into a glove and then put into a trash bag. Several purses that Eugenia owned were also shoved in this trash bag. The family's photo albums, all the pictures of her kids and her grandkids, all shoved in a trash bag and thrown away. Eugenia did not have a car, and so all of this just seemed incredibly strange. But most importantly, where's Eugenia? This image was captured on CCTV on December 21st, 2024. It shows Eugenia walking away from her apartment complex. Seems very casual, like she's just going for a normal walk. But this right here is the last known image of Eugenia Cooley. Her neighbors reported to police that they saw her on December 21st, and that's kind of what led to finding this footage. There was a camera that was facing her apartment door, but unfortunately it was not working. But they are still trying to pour through as much video footage as they can to see if they can find her anywhere else. Eugenia's family have called hospitals. They have called other police stations locally. They have exhausted every option they can think of to see if she might be at those places, but they have found no trace of her. Her cell phones that they found stuffed in a glove and in a trash bag, they were last used at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 21st. And then that's it after that. It certainly sounds like foul play may be involved here, but police aren't positive. The police there in Maysville are trying to explore every avenue of this, but it doesn't really sound like the makings of someone who just like randomly went on vacation for the holidays, because she would have been back by now. It doesn't sound like she went away on her own, because everything she owned, all of her belongings, her wallet, her cell phones, all left at the house. And she also wouldn't just pick up and abandon her family. There is some concern that the police department isn't putting everything they have into finding her, though. Eugenia's family has put a lot of their own effort into organizing private, searches for her. The last known search they did was on January 4th, I believe, but they're trying to organize another one. Surely someone somewhere out there has got to know what happened to Eugenia Cooley, where she is. This is 2025, we have cell phones and tablets everywhere. We have CCTV everywhere. Someone has to have seen her, or at least knows what happened to her. If you have any information on the whereabouts of 47-year-old Eugenia Cooley, please call 606-564-9411. Please help bring Eugenia home. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Gaffney Strangler. Viewer discretion is advised. On May 19th, 1967, Annie Dedmond and her husband Roger had been seen getting into an argument at a nightclub in Gaffney, South Carolina. They reconciled their differences that night, then they went to a restaurant. Roger would go inside the restaurant to pick up some donuts, and when he got back outside to the car, Annie was gone. The following day, off a rural road, the body of Annie Dedmond was found. Annie had been sexually assaulted and she was strangled to death. Her husband, Roger, became the first and only suspect in this. He was questioned and grilled for 2 straight days, and the police would eventually allege that he just confessed to killing her. So he went on trial for her murder, and he was convicted of manslaughter. He would be sentenced to 18 years in prison, but that was not the end. 9 months later, in February of 1968, 20-year-old Nancy Carol Paris, she had gone out to take her dog for a walk, but she never got home. But her husband would report her missing that night when he went out looking for her and couldn't find her. Her nude body was found in Gaffney, South Carolina. She had been murdered. She was strangled and sexually assaulted. Almost right away, February 8th, 1968, 14-year-old Nancy Christine Reinhardt had apparently gone missing, but she was soon found deceased. She was found brutally murdered underneath a pile of brush. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Now, the way that these 2 bodies were found is because a man called a news reporter, someone who wrote for the Gaffney Ledger. The guy who called was Leroy Martin. He would tell this guy from the Gaffney Ledger where he could find 2 bodies. And also, he stated he was responsible for the death of Annie Dedmond, not her husband. So police go to these locations where he stated these 2 bodies would be. Lo and behold, they're found. But they didn't have him because he just made the phone call. He didn't do this in person. Leroy Martin told the person he spoke to at the Ledger, "I am going to kill again." And unfortunately, that became reality. February 13th, 1968. 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton. She was out with her sister on a walk when all of a sudden a car pulled up, grabbed Opal, and threw her into his vehicle and sped away, while her sister was completely helpless. A few days later, in a wooded area, also in the Gaffney, South Carolina area, the body of 15-year-old Opal was found, sexually assaulted and strangled. So 4 victims now, all sexually assaulted, all discarded in wooded areas, and all strangled. So on the day that Opal was abducted, there were 2 private citizens named Lester Skinner and Henry Transeau. They had been looking for the car that was reported that was involved with the kidnapping. And these 2 men actually saw the car hours later. Now, unfortunately, the guy who got into the car noticed these 2 men. He got in and sped away. But the 2 men were able to write down the license plate number, which comes back to Leroy Martin. He is finally apprehended on February 27th, 1968. Apparently, Leroy and his mother would claim that he had suffered from multiple personality disorder. He may be schizophrenic, and that was why he did the things he did. Despite also there being kind of this potential motive of he was just after young women, just wanted to, sexually assault and murder them. And he wasn't, I guess, given adequate representation at trial, and so they took the death penalty off the table because of that. He would eventually be found guilty of all 4 murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Roger Dedmond had served 10 months in prison for the murder of his wife. He was released after 10 months because that's right around the time when the conviction of Leroy Martin occurred. Justice did not do him well at first, but at least in the end, he was finally released. 4 young women, just at the beginning of their lives, but unfortunately their paths crossed with a monster. But at least in the end, these 4 women got the justice they rightfully deserved. This is the last known image of a man who vanished on a cruise ship. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of George Allen Smith IV. Viewer discretion is advised. Sorry, this is going to be a pretty long video again. 26-year-old George Allen Smith, pictured here with his parents and his sister. They were from Greenwich, Connecticut. George's father owned a liquor store, and this is the 2 of them pictured here. And the plan was for George IV to take over the store once his dad retired. George himself was a caring and compassionate person. He had a great sense of humor and a zest for life. Everyone loved being around him. His presence just seemed to make everything better. Eventually, he would fall in love with this woman here, Jennifer Hagel, and they got married. They were married on June 25th, 2005. And this is them pictured here just a day or so before they're leaving for their honeymoon cruise. The cruise they were going on was going to be setting sail from Barcelona in Spain, and it would be making stops in Greece, in Turkey, in Italy, and it was specifically the Brilliance of the Seas cruise. George and Jennifer boarded the cruise in hopes of having a really wonderful time. This is a photo of them on July 4th, 2005, and this is when they were touring Mykonos in Greece. And Greece was one of George's absolutely most favorite places to go. This is a photo of George and Jennifer that same night back aboard the cruise ship having dinner, and by all accounts, they were having a great time. Around midnight or so, now rolling into July 5th, 2005, George and Jennifer entered the casino on the cruise ship. This is CCTV footage of Jennifer in the casino. And around that same time, this is footage of George in the same casino. This right here is the last known image of George Allen Smith, because just hours later, he would vanish from the cruise ship. The following morning, everyone was kind of waking up on the cruise ship, and one of the guests aboard the ship had noticed this massive blood stain on a canopy on a lifeboat. This was actually just below the balcony of George and Jennifer's room. Now, Jennifer apparently wakes up in the room, I'm assuming, and notices that George is missing. This is all kind of coinciding with the time that people found the blood. And so she has to alert the people on the cruise ship that she can't find her husband. In the room, investigators will find 2 very small blood stains on the sheets that was on their bed. The room was messy, but it was not in any kind of like chaotic disarray or anything. There was a chair propped against the back, patio glass, but no other signs of foul play. Jennifer claims that she has a very foggy memory after, she left the casino. She was apparently found by another guest sleeping in a sitting position in the hallway on the ship. And that was around 4:30 a.m. And after that, she doesn't really remember much, she says. They found out that George had been interacting with this man here, Josh Askin, the night before all this happened. Or, I guess, technically the night that it did happen. And through that, they found out that he was actually hanging out with 4 total men, one of them being Josh. The other 3 were Russian-American men, Rusty Kaufman, Greg Rosenberg, and Zach Rosenberg. Apparently, all 4 men were seen in the company with George Allen Smith. Witnesses in adjoining rooms would state that that night, they heard the sounds of men arguing or screaming at each other, and it would have come from the direction of the balcony of George and Jennifer's room. Some witnesses heard the sounds of furniture moving within that room, and other suspicious noises. And on top of that, you've got this big old pile of blood. They also found, small traces of blood on the balcony railing or something around the balcony. And most importantly, George is missing. The staff aboard the cruise ship literally investigated this for about 2 hours, according to Jennifer. The FBI didn't even become involved until 2 days after the disappearance. The cruise ship also docked in the interim, meaning that after George disappeared, and before the FBI became involved, people, because it had docked, people had come and gone from the ship, meaning they could have taken any evidence of a crime off of the ship with them, because they weren't being frisked, they weren't being, detained or anything. Nobody was really even being questioned. And the cruise ship maintains that he had to have gone overboard accidentally because he was intoxicated. Eventually, from what it sounds like, these 4 men would be talked to and questioned. They stated that they were, in fact, with George that night. They said they then brought him back to his stateroom, in which they actually assisted him taking off his shoes, and one of his shoes is right there. Then they left and went back to one of their rooms and ordered room service. And then they didn't see George after that, but when they left the room, George was alive. Now, there really is no doubt that George went overboard. I mean, that is the only possible explanation as to what could have happened to him. The question, though, is how did it occur? Did he fall over accidentally, or was he forced over it? Well, the blood on the canopy, the blood on the sheets would indicate that some kind of struggle actually did occur, but nobody took that blood and tested it. It wasn't even collected, and it's gone now. The cruise ship really just did not seem to care. And it was just business as usual for them. And that really hindered any type of investigation that could be done. The FBI allegedly had investigated this for years and years, and eventually they came to the conclusion that there was not enough evidence to show that he was murdered, and that they basically have just closed the case. Now, sadly, the family will never get George back. I mean, he's gone. He went into that water, and he's just gone. But that doesn't mean they can't get the truth about what actually happened to him that night. Now, eventually, according to some investigation that was done into this, there were a whole bunch of documents and records with regards to all the things that happened on the cruise ship, like normal processes. That included the room service stuff. And throughout every single folder and binder they looked in to find out if these four men actually ordered room service that night, like they claimed, there was no indication that they ordered room service at all. And to make matters even more disturbing, a video surfaced. It sounds like the FBI actually has this video, but they have never released it. The video consists of all 4 of these men passing around this camera, this video camera or phone or whatever they used, and they were all commenting and making jest of George dying. This was the night that he disappeared. That's when the video was taken. And at one point, one of them stands up in the video and very proudly and emphatically states, "Told ya I was a gangsta," and it sounded like he was bragging about George's death. And apparently, this video still isn't enough. They still said, yeah, it was an accident. They all deny having anything to do with what happened to him. But that video, I mean, what? The blood? The witnesses who heard an argument with men inside that room, the sound of a struggle in the room, the sound of furniture moving in that room, 1 + 1 is 2. They know something. And I know what you guys might be thinking, well, what about Jennifer? Well, quite honestly, her whereabouts that entire night are unknown. It sounds like George's family is not really sure if she's being truthful. And to them, I'm just reading from an article, it sounds like to them that she is almost trying to lead people away from this idea of a murder, that it was just an accident. She has since remarried, and George is gone. He's lost. And what's most insane is that there are suspects in this. There is enough, at least circumstantial evidence to say, okay, he might have been murdered. He might have been thrown overboard after an altercation. But nobody wanted to investigate it that way. It took days for the FBI to even become involved. Evidence could have been easily taken off of that boat before they got involved. And sadly, unless somebody comes forward, unless somebody says, I know exactly what happened, or if one of those 4 men confesses, the family may never know exactly what happened to him. But somebody somewhere out there might know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. You can report information anonymously. Anyone with information on the death or the disappearance of George Allen Smith IV, please call 844-651-1936. Did he kill them on their own, or was he encouraged? Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Glensheen Mansion murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here is the beautiful Glensheen Mansion, which is located near Duluth, Minnesota. Construction began on it in 1905, and it was constructed by a man named Chester Congdon. One of Chester and his wife Clara's daughters was Elizabeth. Elizabeth Congdon was actually born in 1894. She herself never got married, but she did end up adopting 2 children, one of them being this woman here, Marjorie Congdon. Now, Elizabeth Congdon would end up inheriting the 39-bedroom mansion from her father when he passed away. It's a massive property. It's 22 acres large. And essentially, Elizabeth lived in this giant home kind of all on her own. Sometime shortly before this case happened, Elizabeth ended up having a stroke. She was then basically confined to a wheelchair and she was paralyzed on one side of her body. And she needed round-the-clock care. And so she had a friend and a nurse named Velma Pietla. Elizabeth had to constantly bail out Marjorie. Marjorie seemed to always be getting herself into trouble. And it got to a point where Elizabeth was done with it. But Marjorie, well, she wanted money. On June 27th, 1977, at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, 2 bodies were found discovered inside Glensheen Mansion. On the grand staircase landing, the body of the nurse, Velma Pietla, had been found. She had been bludgeoned over the head with a candlestick. The body of Elizabeth Congdon had been found on her bed. She had been smothered with a satin pillow. Because of Elizabeth's on-again, off-again issues with her adopted daughter Marjorie, Marjorie became an almost immediate suspect in this because she was also set to inherit about $8 million and the estate. And well, I mean, right, her mom, her adopted mom, was getting close to the end of her life. She was wheelchair bound, so why not push her a little bit along to get that money sooner? This was Roger Caldwell, who was Marjorie's husband at the time. Well, a cab driver would actually end up coming forward to police to state that he dropped Roger off near the mansion the night the murders would have happened. There was, I guess, some kind of envelope or something found near one of the bodies that had a fingerprint on it that the prosecution would state was Roger's fingerprint, even though he should not have ever been in that mansion. But the witness, the cab driver, and the fingerprint placed him in the house. Not to mention the fact that he, along with his wife Marjorie, would inherit millions and millions of dollars. So he was arrested and charged with 2 murders. Marjorie was then arrested after him and also charged with both murders. Roger Caldwell would end up being found guilty of both homicides and sentenced to 2 life sentences. At the trial, apparently the defense put up someone who disputed the fingerprint analysis on that envelope, but he was convicted anyway. Now, Marjorie, it was different with her. They had no physical evidence actually connecting her directly to the murders. No fingerprints, obviously no DNA, it's 1977. They couldn't even place her at the house or even near it, but she could have orchestrated it, which is what they think is actually what happened. However, because the prosecution really had very little evidence, she was acquitted, meaning that they could never recharge her again. Then, a couple of years later, Roger Caldwell's, his entire conviction is overturned. And that was a lot to do with some evidence that I guess was presented at Marjorie's trial. And this time, the prosecution did not want to risk a not guilty verdict. So they offered him a deal, and he actually would confess to both murders, and he pled guilty to second-degree murder. And that happened on July 5th, 1983, and he was resentenced to time served, meaning he was essentially released that day. About 10, 12 years later or so, he ends his own life. Now, I believe that Marjorie did end up inheriting the money. However, the inheritance was only giving her like $40,000 a year or something like that. Her children, because she had kids of her own, would also file a lawsuit against her, stating that she was involved in the murders of Elizabeth and Velma, and that the inheritance should go to them. I'm not 100% sure what happened in the end, though. The prosecutor from Roger's trial apparently withheld some information that there was something else on the envelope other than a fingerprint. And many, many years that goes by, he has that envelope tested for DNA. And they do find DNA on that envelope, which was in the house with them, at the murder scene, where he claimed he was never there. The DNA found on that envelope was a match to Roger Caldwell. So they know that he was in that house and that he likely committed those murders. More than likely, but you can't say for sure, but more than likely at the request of his dear wife. Marjorie, by the way, would later go on to commit several arsons. She spent several different stints in prison. She has been accused of killing at least one of her husbands, but never actually convicted or tried for it. And she has led a life of crime ever since the double homicide. And apparently she's still alive and kicking and living in Arizona. Out of prison now, at least for now. And if we're being honest here, Elizabeth and Velma, they didn't get real justice. Not at all. It would be her own research that helped catch her killer. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Helena Greenwood. Viewer discretion is advised. Helena Greenwood was actually born in England in 1949. She earned her doctorate in chemical pathology from the University of London and was well-versed in the world of DNA. Helena was an incredibly intelligent person. She was considered very business savvy, which would end up making her a shoo-in for roles in the biotech industry. So her and her husband Roger would eventually move to California here in the States. Her husband Roger was an architect, very successful, and Helena took on a job here at GenProbe, where she was doing some research and pioneering the field of DNA. Specifically, in this case, it was DNA that would help, I guess, detect diseases. But then one night, everything changed for the worse. It was April 7th, 1984. Roger was out of town, and so Helena was home alone, when all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, a shadow appeared at the bedroom door, and then this shadow is hovering above her, threatening her, saying, "If you scream, I will kill you." This shadowy figure then sexually assaults her, robs her, and then leaves the house. Helena goes to police almost right away. She did not get a very good look at the man. She can see that he had some kind of olive complexion to his skin, but she really didn't know much else. Now, there was male bodily fluid found on a pillow next to where this happened, which was collected. But in 1984, DNA technology still wasn't advanced enough to do much with that. They believe that the person entered the home through a window, and it was through the kitchen. Just outside the kitchen, on this little table, was this little teapot that normally Helena kept inside on the counter. So what they think happened was that the perpetrator opened the window, grabbed the teapot from the top and moved it to get out of his way so that he would get in the house without making any noise. Well, they took that teapot and they tested it and they dusted it and they found several fingerprints, none of which belonged to Helena or her husband Roger. So they think this came from her attacker. Unfortunately, though, when they put those fingerprints into the database, they did not get a match. But then, 10 months later, they got a hit. This man here, David Frediani, about 7 miles away from where Helena's attack took place, he had been arrested for exposing himself to a 12-year-old child. And at that time, he gave his fingerprints. And so when they run his fingerprints, it comes up as a match to the ones found on Helena's teapot. When confronted with this by police, he just said, "Oh man, I was really drunk probably when I did those things." But he didn't specify. But he did still deny having anything to do with her sexual assault. But he is arrested. Now, they have a preliminary hearing in which Helena is there to testify. However, at the preliminary hearing, she is unable to positively identify Frediani as her attacker because, again, he was wearing a mask, a hoodie, dark clothes. She did not get a good look at him. But the DA said, well, we have the fingerprints and we have the same blood type because the DNA found on her pillow was the same blood type as him, but that's about as much as they could do. But they're like, all right, we're going to go to trial with this. The trial was set for 1985, but before it could begin, a murder occurred. On August 22nd, 1985, Helena Greenwood failed to show up to her work. Her colleague said it was extremely unusual for her to do that, especially since there was a very important meeting scheduled that day that she had to be at. So her coworkers called Roger, and Roger, who was at work at the time, left his job to go back to their home. He arrives back at their house and there's something blocking like the gates to the yard. When he looks over it, he sees Helena lying on the ground. Her purse and her belongings, cash, everything is just strewn about, but nothing was stolen. But sadly, Helena was deceased. Helena had been strangled to death. She also had blood underneath her fingernails, indicating she scratched her attacker and that she fought like hell. Helena was strangled and murdered in broad daylight. Police felt that this was very personal. The first suspect that came to mind, David Frediani. He was the only one with a true motive. However, he denied having anything to do with it. You see, he said, well, I'm living up in the Bay Area, and Helena and her husband lived actually in San Diego. So there's no way he could have done this. Well, he would still go on trial for the rape charge, and he was found guilty of it. And he was sentenced to 6 years, but only served 3. And now, on the day in question, the day that Helena was killed, there was also a vehicle accident somewhere kind of outside that area. That occurred in Valencia near Six Flags Magic Mountain. And the police would learn that the person involved in that vehicle accident was none other than David Frediani. And that would indicate to police that he was on his way down to San Diego. Now, in a great little twist here, the DNA research that Helena was doing at the time of her murder is what led to the breakthrough of being able to create a DNA profile from tiny, minuscule skin cells, which is basically what was found underneath her fingernails. At the time when it was caught, it was too degraded to test. But because of her research, they were able to test it. That DNA came back to a match. It belonged to David Frediani. His DNA under her fingernails when she was murdered. So in 1999, he officially is arrested for her murder and he goes on trial. And again, thanks to DNA, thanks in part to Helena for two reasons. One, for scratching him, and two, for the research she did, she was able to catch her own killer. David Frediani was sentenced to life in prison without parole. May he rot forever. The wig would end up saving her life. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Hollandsburg Massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. Valentine's Day 1977, Betty Jane Spencer would rush to a neighbor's home and say, "I've been shot. My boys have been shot." When police arrived at the trailer that she lived in with her 4 sons, they found a massacre. The victims were Betty's son, Gregory Brooks, and her 3 stepkids, Ralph, Raymond, and Reeve Spencer. All of them had been shot and killed with shotgun blasts at close range. Betty Spencer had also been shot multiple times, including once towards her head. She would tell police that the shooters shot at her head and her wig blew off. And the shooter assumed that the wig was actually a part of her head. And so she immediately thought to play dead until the 4 men who entered their trailer left. And when she looked over, she said she heard the sound of what sounded like a waterfall. And that was actually the blood flowing out of the bodies of all 4 boys. Their heads blown apart. And so she manages to get up, run to a neighbor's house, because when she tried to call, she noticed that they had cut her phone lines. And that's police arrive a few minutes later, and they find the massacre. A few things had been stolen, but it did seem like the motive here was to just kill. And Betty was the only witness. She was the only person who saw these men. She would help come up with these composite drawings of the men. It took thousands of man-hours and roughly 20 or so days to finally capture these men. One of them was a man named Daniel Stonebreaker. He had been arrested about 22 days after the murders for something completely unrelated. But they knew he was a part of this little gang of men led by a man named Roger Drollinger, who also included David Smith and Michael Wright. Roger Drollinger was scheduled to go to prison the day after the massacre for drug charges. And Daniel Stonebreaker would essentially end up telling police that they were the ones responsible for the quadruple homicide, and that it was all Roger Drollinger's idea. He said, "Hey, I'm about to go to prison tomorrow, and I want to do something crazy. I want to kill some people." He wanted to thrill kill. That's what his motive was. He just chose a random house. He didn't know the Spencers, just chose it. And the 4 of them entered the home and stole a couple little things. But again, their goal was to just kill people. And there were 5 people inside. They waited for the Betty's husband to leave that morning because they saw him leaving. Figured maybe we couldn't overpower him. And then they entered the home. So once all this came out, Roger Drollinger was still on the run, but he was eventually captured. And he would be charged with the murders, along with the other 3 men. They all actively participated in this. They didn't stop him from trying to do this. They fired the weapons. They were all very equally responsible for this. And it was senseless. It was completely senseless. They just chose a house. And Roger said, I want to kill someone. And unbelievably, they went along with it. That's just insane to me. At any rate, all 4 men eventually went to trial. All 4 men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Thanks a lot to Betty for being the survivor. I mean, she was able to testify against them and confirm that those were the men. And she was incredibly thankful that they thought that her wig being shot off of her head was actually part of her head and they didn't shoot her anymore. That saved her life. Betty has since passed away in the early 2000s from natural causes. Roger Drollinger has died in prison. The other 3 men have attempted to get parole numerous times, but they have to this day still been denied parole. And they rot in a prison cell, hopefully, for the rest of their sad, pathetic lives. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Irene Graves. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Irene Graves was a 41-year-old mother to 3 kids. She had a daughter and 2 sons. Irene was an incredible mom. She did literally everything she could do to make sure they were taken care of. She was working 3 jobs just to support them. Irene wanted to make sure that her kids had a good life and they had fun and that they were always taken care of, that they had food on the table. And she did just that. Her kids described her as a good woman, a fun woman, and someone who just loved. One of the jobs she was working was at a Speedway convenience store, which was located in Greenville, South Carolina. And that's where she was working on Halloween night, 1997. Grainy surveillance footage, which was not very clear, would show 2 men walking into the gas station where she worked. Pointing a gun at Irene, the 2 men told her to open up the safe when she didn't know the combination, so she says, I can't open it, I don't know the combo. So one of the men just raised a gun to her head and pulled the trigger, instantly killing the 41-year-old mother of 3, without any hesitation, without any care in the world. Their investigation would lead them to this man here, Stephen Golden, and the police had grilled him because obviously they knew there was a second person, and he named this man, Freddie Owens, as the other man in the footage. The other man who was responsible for Irene's death. And eventually they found out that Freddie Owens actually ended up confessing to being involved in the murder multiple times. Freddie told his girlfriend, his mom, and 2 separate police officers. And it sounds like that the other man, Stephen Golden, had put the gun in Freddie's hand, the gun that shot and killed Irene. The 2 men did get away with some money because she was able to open the register. What was her life worth to these 2 men? $37.29. That's it. And according to Stephen Golden, when she said she couldn't open the safe, that Freddie just said, "Oh well," and then shot her in the head. At one point, Mr. Golden referred to Irene as the whore, that Freddie shot and killed the whore. So both men are arrested and charged with connections to this murder. Stephen Golden is convicted and sentenced to 28 years in prison for his involvement. Freddie Owens, because he was the one who pulled the trigger and shot Irene, was sentenced to death. Now, before he was sentenced to death, in the interim, he actually ended up killing somebody else. He murdered a cellmate. 24 years later, Freddie Owens was scheduled to be executed. And just before that happens, Stephen Golden recants his confession, basically. He stated that Freddie was not actually there. I lied. That it was somebody else who was with him. Someone he wouldn't name, I guess. That he only said Freddie Owens' name because the police, that's the name they wanted him to say. But there was other evidence found by police that actually linked Freddie Owens directly to this murder. Not to mention the fact that they had statements from multiple people that he confessed to his involvement. So the execution was, I think, temporarily halted, but it was then put back on. On September 20th, 2024, so just a few months ago, Freddie Owens was executed by lethal injection. And Irene Graves, the loving, caring, kind, and supportive mother to 3, got the justice she rightfully deserved. She was house-sitting for her parents, and then she vanished. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jenna Van Gelderen. Viewer discretion is advised. Jenna Van Gelderen was born in 1992, and as she was growing up as a kid, she did have some difficulties in elementary school. She would eventually be diagnosed with a nonverbal learning disability. She was always a very impressionable young woman. She was very trusting. Jenna grew up in a very loving home. She also had a brother, and the family as a whole was just very, very close with each other. By about 2016 or so, Jenna would be diagnosed with autism. She was considered high functioning. And, by the time this story takes place, her family wasn't super aware of what her social life was really like. Who she hung out with, who were all of her friends. She had moved out of her parents' house sometime shortly before this case occurred. It's believed she was staying in a room with a friend of hers. 6 months prior to this case occurring, she had been fired from the only full-time job she ever really had. and she had been working at a pet store. And the reason why Jenna was fired from the job was because she had stolen about $3,000 in cash, and she would end up being charged with a misdemeanor. Her parents at that point would become very concerned about who she was friends with. They even speculated that possibly that money she stole was for her to give to her friends, because again, she was very trusting and she could be convinced of things easily. And she had a cell phone that was in her father's name, and it got to a point where he had accessed her cell phone records just to kind of see, who she was interacting with. And that made Jenna very, very mad, and so she ends up getting her own cell phone without their knowledge. And that's about the time where she had moved out of the house as well. In August of 2017, Jenna's parents were going to be out on vacation, and they asked Jenna if she could house sit for them and take care of the cats, and she agreed to do that. Again, despite, the issues they may have had, they were still a very, very close family. Jenna was last seen on August 19th, 2017. At about 2 o'clock that morning, she texted a friend to say that she was going to start lying down to go to sleep. That right there was the final text message that Jenna ever sent. When her parents got back home from their vacation in Canada, and by the way, this happened in the Atlanta, Georgia area, all of the lights in the house were on. They noticed that their cats were not being fed, and Jenna was missing from the home, as was her car, a Mazda. Jenna's shoes were still in the house. Her phone charger was still in the house. She kept all of her toiletries in a grocery bag, and all of those were still in the house. These are things that her family knows, because they know her better than anyone, she would bring with her if she was going somewhere. And also, Jenna would never not feed the cats. She actually really adored those cats. Something else that's very interesting was that there was one thing other than Jenna missing from the home. It was this Egyptian artwork. It had been in a glass frame, and so it was like a tapestry, where the tapestry was removed. And you can see here that a corner of the glass was broken so that someone could retrieve it. It really wasn't worth much money, according to the family. It was more of just a keepsake. Now, her 2 cell phones that she had were both missing from the house, as well as the suitcase she had gone to the house with. On September 5th, 2017, about 2 weeks or so after her disappearance, her car is found parked along this road. And that was in northwest Atlanta. This was roughly 7 miles from her parents' home. The car was almost on an empty gas tank, and in the car they found the suitcase, but they did not find her phones. Also in the car, they found another pair of her shoes. They found her wallet. There was also, a pair of shoes in the car that did not belong to Jenna. They wouldn't have fit her. And they also found her other phone charger. So now they know she does not have her chargers. She doesn't have her wallet. She doesn't have any of her belongings. And now it's becoming, oh my God, what happened to Jenna? Police will go to the location where Jenna was living at this, so-called friend's house. And the friend told police that he or she was about to take all of Jenna's belongings and throw them out onto the yard because Jenna wasn't paying rent that she agreed to pay. And when police asked him, can we please, go inside your place? The person said no. He actually refused to let them in the home. However, that being said, police have stated that this individual has not been named a suspect. Jenna also did have a boyfriend around that time, and he had seen her on August 18th, 2017, the day prior to her disappearance, where apparently he had broken up with her at that point. And I don't know if he has been labeled or ever considered a suspect or person of interest. I'm not sure. There is no, direct actual evidence that she had met with foul play, meaning there's just no sign of a crime scene in terms of any kind of altercation happening, any blood, any DNA, any hair. It doesn't mean foul play wasn't involved. They just don't have proof of it. And so they really just don't know what happened to her. Her cell phone last pinged on August 19th, 2017 at approximately 7:15 in the morning, and it pinged off a tower in Fairburn, Georgia, which was 20 miles south of where her parents lived. All of it is just very bizarre. It's very suspicious. And with it, this happening in modern times, this is only not that long ago, where everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a tablet, a computer. Her image is out there for all to see. Surely someone would have seen her at this point. And that is cause for grave concern that no one has really claimed to have spotted her ever since she disappeared. And they just want to know what happened to Jenna on that August 19th evening. That mystery still remains. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Jenna Van Gelderen, who went missing in 2017, please call the Atlanta Crime Stoppers at 404-577-8477. This fella is wanted for kidnapping, but he's never been caught. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of John Grundhofer. Viewer discretion is advised. John Grundhofer was a wealthy businessman, wealthy CEO, and I guess a bank in Minnesota had brought him in to kind of help to salvage their bank. And he did so by the art of firing people. It was tough. Tough on a lot of people, well, except for him. But that could lead to having a whole bunch of enemies. And it's possible one of those enemies kidnapped him. It was November 19th, 1990. John had pulled into the parking garage of his bank when he was approached by a shadowy figure. This man approached John, called himself Carl, and said that basically he was here to abduct him. And he pulled out a gun and pointed it at John, and then a struggle ensued where John and this man fought. And then another man comes into the parking garage, and these are recreations, obviously, and sees this struggle. He begins to approach them when both men stand up, and they say, hey, everything's good to go. You're good. You can just leave. But then the guy behind shows this man his gun and forces him to leave the parking garage. When then the kidnapper forces John into John's car at gunpoint and makes him drive out of the parking garage. This, by the way, is the witness who saw this altercation, so he is a real person who actually saw this event occur. Now, in the car, the kidnapper's in the back seat. He takes a handcuff and he handcuffs John's left arm to dynamite, saying, if you get any funny ideas, I'm going to detonate it. While this is going on, someone in the parking garage of where John was abducted from found this note. It said, do exactly as you are told and be quiet, and nobody, you or your family, will get hurt. And then there's a checklist. Unlock the car. Open lock to back seat. Get in driver seat. Keep both hands visible. Basically a cheat sheet on how to kidnap someone, I guess. But this was obviously found in the area where this abduction happened, so they knew that this was the abductor who wrote this. At one point, the kidnapper makes John stop off somewhere, and he's rifling through his bag, and he's like, where is it? Where's the note? What happened to it? And John's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't see any note. The dude realized he lost his cheat sheet on how to kidnap someone. He lost it, and that made him upset, which is honestly funny as fuck. The kidnapper then brings John to a location where he can call his work. And that's when the ransom demand is made, $3 million. And what was odd to the FBI was that the kidnapper had asked for $1,000 bills, which I honestly did not know ever existed, but they were real at one point. But the FBI, based on the cheat sheet they found in the parking garage and the fact that he asked for $1,000 bills, told them that this kidnapper had absolutely no idea what the fuck he was doing, that this was new to him, he was not a professional, and it kind of gave the profile of someone who just really had it out for John, perhaps somebody he was responsible for firing. But it didn't help them identify who this man was. After the ransom demand is made, the guy takes John and forces him into these woods where he puts him in a sleeping bag. He ties John to a tree and also binds his arms behind him and then takes the dynamite off and walks away. And he never comes back ever again. Just gone. So John manages to free himself from his bindings. He runs to a nearby farmhouse where he contacts the police. John was able to give a description of the kidnapper because they got a pretty good look at him, and this is a description or an image they came up with. He really looks like someone I'm familiar with. Is that not Mr. Anderson, Tom Anderson from Beavis and Butthead? That's him, right? Damn it, Bobby! Wait, that's the wrong guy. Anyway, when the image is released to the media, a couple people come forward to state that they think they know who that man is. They think it's a man named John Henderson. This guy kind of looks like, maybe like an older John Candy. And the images compared side to side, he looks similar, yeah. So they put John Henderson in a police lineup where then John Grundhofer would look at these men, and he identified John Henderson as his kidnapper. However, the witness from earlier, Jeff Rasmussen, who saw the altercation in the parking garage, also did a police lineup and did not identify him. And John Henderson was in that lineup, but he was not recognized by Jeff. Nobody was. But John Grundhofer was positive that that was him. John Henderson vehemently denies having anything to do with this kidnapping. John Henderson has zero connections to the bank or to John Grundhofer at all. The police, the FBI, found not a single connection. Not even family members who had been working at the bank who got fired. That wasn't present either. They never had any physical evidence, so he was never actually arrested. They also made him do a handwriting test to compare the handwriting from that note. Was not even close to being a match. Years later, John Henderson would be completely cleared and ruled out of being involved in the kidnapping. And this man, whoever he may have been, has never been identified. Now again, there was a witness who saw this man with a gun pointing to the back of John that had kidnapped him. So they knew that that actually occurred. The reason why I'm saying that is because there are people down the road who said that John Grundhofer probably made this up, that he staged the kidnapping in order to get sympathy from the public after being vilified for firing so many people. But police never had evidence of that either. And there were witnesses who saw the other man, not just the other employee, but other people saw him as well. And again, that theory was never substantiated. They never had any proof or evidence that he staged it. And as of now, they still believe that this was an actual kidnapping. By the way, the $3 million that he had asked for, the kidnapper never went to get it. The kidnapper just suddenly left, which was extremely odd. Maybe he chickened out, he got scared. Again, he was very inexperienced, it seemed. But John Grundhofer in 2021 passed away, and he never really got any kind of closure or justice for what happened to him. But there may be someone out there who recognizes this guy here. And if you do recognize him or you know more about this story, you are asked to contact your local FBI office. Inside these two suitcases was a horrific nightmare. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Laura Simonson and Jenny Gamez. Viewer discretion is advised. It was June 5th, 2014, along this stretch of road near Geneva, Wisconsin. A few highway workers were doing some road work when they noticed two suitcases. It just appeared that someone had thrown their suitcases from their car, or maybe they fell off of their car. But then they got closer and noticed that there was a really horrible odor coming from them. And so police were called. When they opened the suitcases, they found black trash bags inside, and in those trash bags were the remains of two different women. One of the women was very quickly identified as 37-year-old Laura Simonson. Laura was last seen at the Rochester Hotel in Farmington, Minnesota back in 2013. And she was reported missing, and it would be dental records that would quickly identify that one of the remains in the suitcase was her. The other victim in the other suitcase was not so quickly identified. So she was technically a Jane Doe. And when they began to put out her images to the nationwide media, finally someone from Oregon would identify her. And that happened at the end of June in 2014. She was identified as 19-year-old Jenny Gamez. Jenny had last been seen in Cottage Grove, Oregon. She had told her family that she was moving. And so when they hadn't heard from her in a while, they just kind of assumed she was still moving about. But sadly, they were horrified once they saw her image on the news. In their investigation, police would discover that both women had at some point interacted with the same online profile on some sort of online dating site or adult site, a user by the name of Mr. Handcuffs from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was identified as Stephen Zelich, a former police officer. I'm not sure how long it took for them to get this out of him, but when confronted by the information about how both of these women had interacted with him, and then suddenly both of those women had gone missing, well, he would basically end up confessing to his involvement in both women's deaths. He didn't say he deliberately murdered them, though. No. And this is police pulling evidence out of his apartment, but basically what he said was that they had been engaged in sex here in his apartment in Wisconsin, and this is at two separate times, one in 2012, one in 2013, but he said in both instances, both women died accidentally during some extreme or rough sexual acts, that he choked them and it went too far. Like, I can maybe understand if, oh my gosh, accidentally it happened once, but then it happened again. Sounds pretty deliberate to me. So what he did after they were both dead, he stored them in one of his freezers. And then for some time, he stored them in his trunk. And then eventually, he just shoved them both into their own suitcase and then just dumped them on the side of the road like they were just garbage. What a guy. He would end up pleading guilty to the murders. The then 55-year-old man pled guilty to second-degree murder. For Jenny Gamez's murder, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. And then for the murder of Laura Simonson, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, the prison sentences are going to run back-to-back, meaning he has to serve the entire 35 years for the first murder, and then after that is done, he will then begin to serve his sentence for the other murder. So effectively, he got 60 years in prison. And at the age of 55 when he was sentenced, it's a life sentence for him. I just don't believe him that this was an accident. Like I said, maybe one time you could maybe see it happening once as an accident, but then again, a second time, no. But at least Laura and Jenny's families finally got them back. They got to lay them to rest, and they got the justice they both rightfully deserved. Was she kidnapped, was she murdered, or was she just given away? To this day, nobody knows. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Lauren Jackson. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Lauren Jackson was just 5 years old. Her parents were Mickey Jackson and Christina O'Donnell. They were not married. Lauren had an uphill battle from birth. She was born with a lot of health issues, but pretty much every time she overcame them. She was a fighter. In her 5 brief years, she was described as caring, loving, and sweet. But 5 years is all the world ever got from her. Lauren was living with her mother, Christina, in East Vincent, Pennsylvania. Mickey and Christina were not together anymore, and they were doing like a shared custody thing there for a while. But Mickey was attempting to get full custody of Lauren. That is because Christina had run into some issues with the law. She had been arrested for attempting to illegally obtain prescription drugs. She pretended to be a doctor, falsified information to a pharmacy. She would end up pleading guilty to that and be sentenced to probation. And it's through all that they discovered that she did have a substance abuse issue. And apparently the neighborhood that Christina was living in with Lauren was not the best. It gave Mickey a lot of concerns. So given the living situation, given the drug abuse problem, the criminal record, he was going to be filing for full custody. And then Lauren disappears. It was October 4th, 1988. Christina took Lauren and also Christina's 12-year-old daughter with another individual. She took them out to go eat some burgers. 2 hours later, they returned back to the apartment. That night, Christina's 12-year-old daughter was to be babysitting for another couple in the same apartment complex, so she was not returning back to this apartment that night. So it was just Christina and Lauren. When they got home, Lauren asked to go outside and play with her friend. Christina said yes. They were just out front on the front little yard area, and Christina says this was at about 7:15 p.m. She checks on them and then goes back inside, then comes back out about 20 minutes later, and no one is there anymore. Both Christina and the neighborhood boy were gone. So Christina goes to knock on that kid's mother's door, but nobody answers. Christina alleges that she found out later on that night that the little boy's mother had picked him up and took him to the mall and just left Lauren outside. Almost like in this accusatory way, when it was Christina, it was her child to pay attention to. So then Christina goes into immediate search mode. She begins to comb the entire apartment complex, knocking on doors, but she can't find Lauren. And so by 9:15 p.m., she contacts police, and then police would notify Mickey. And everyone comes together at the apartment complex, and suddenly there's just hundreds of people there, all looking for 5-year-old Lauren Jackson. Mickey says that when he got there, Christina would refuse to talk to him. She wouldn't say a word to him. He thought that was kind of strange. They brought in cadaver dogs, search dogs, they brought in helicopters, they had people searching on foot, turning over every stone, looking under every leaf and bush, and they found nothing. Apparently, one of the scent dogs would pick up her scent approximately 1 mile away from her home, and this was on Route 724 near a motel. But the scent kind of just stopped there. It was very sporadic. An 11-year-old girl would come forward to the FBI to state that she thinks she saw Lauren get abducted by a man, by 2 people. Someone was driving this car when all of a sudden another guy gets out and just scoops up this girl from the street and puts her in the car, and the car speeds away. The 11-year-old girl who witnessed this says the little girl looked a lot like Lauren. Then another witness came forward, and this time it was accusatory towards Christina. The witness says that at approximately 7 p.m. at the mall parking lot, she saw someone take a little girl and force her into another person's car. Someone else was driving the car, a couple. The car then just takes off with the little girl inside, leaving the other woman outside. The witness says that that woman was Christina. However, there are holes in that story. The witness swears she is adamant that she saw this happen at 7 p.m. But there were other witnesses, not just Christina, other witnesses saw the two kids, including Lauren, playing just outside on the front lawn at 7:15 p.m. So there's no way that Christina just gave her kid to some random person in a mall parking lot, and then suddenly 15 minutes later, that same little girl is outside playing. Now, I don't know for sure if they've questioned the boy's mom. I have to imagine they have, and everything has been ruled out. My brain was thinking, did this even actually happen? That's what my brain thought. But it sounds like witnesses did see the two kids playing. There are many people who believe that Christina O'Donnell was somehow involved in her daughter's disappearance. The motive could have been that she did not want Mickey to get full custody, and maybe she knew he would get it, and that she was just kind of doing it to him. And also she may have felt very overwhelmed by raising her daughter, and that's why she may have done something to her. But what that is, it's not known. Police did label her a suspect, but they also labeled Mickey a suspect at one point, but they cleared him, and he maintains that he believes Christina was involved. Other people believe that Christina was involved, but there's no proof of that. There's no proof of what happened to Lauren at all. You have multiple different witness testimonies that witness completely different things. One girl sees her get abducted. Another woman sees the child being basically sold off to another couple. The dogs have her scent being traced down near a motel a mile away. But you have witnesses who saw the little girl outside of her home. Were they mistaken? Did they not see Lauren but thought they did? That's a possibility. All they know for sure is that Lauren Jackson is gone. She was there. She was observed there on October 4th, 1988. So they know she was alive that day at some point. But what actually happened to her? I think they can even confirm that she did have, that fast food, that hamburger with her 12-year-old stepsister and her mom. So they know she was alive then. But what happened later that night? That has remained a mystery this entire time. Christina has since passed away. And if she had any secrets about what happened to her daughter, they went with her. But maybe she wasn't involved. That's always a strong possibility. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Lauren Jackson on that day in 1988. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information, please call 610-933-0115. On the afternoon of August 17, 1958, in the vastness of Death Valley, a vehicle was found, but where was its owner? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Lieutenant Paul Whipkey. Viewer discretion is advised. On that August 17th, 1958, a fish and game warden was driving down the road in Death Valley, California, when he came across this vehicle. This was a recreation. There was nobody with the car. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of foul play. The keys were in the ignition, but there was nothing else of note in the car. It would soon be determined that that vehicle belonged to Lieutenant Paul Whipkey. Paul had been stationed here at Fort Ord in California, but he had not been seen or heard from since July 10th, 1958, at least not seen by anyone from the base or anyone that knew him personally. He was 26 years old at the time he was last seen, and he was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was an ROTC honors graduate. Soon after graduating, he would begin his aviation training. By July of 1956, he was stationed at Fort Ord. In 1957, he was then stationed at Camp Desert Rock in Nevada, where he flew an observation plane during the atomic bomb testings, which actually ended up giving him some minor radiation poisoning. It actually caused lesions on his skin, and he would end up having to remove all of his teeth. But, other than that, everything was perfectly fine for him. He was in great spirits. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Eventually, he is moved back to Fort Ord, which is where he was on July 10th, 1958, and he would leave the base that afternoon stating that he was going to be going to Monterey, California, which was about a mile away, and then he would be back later. He never came back. Within a week, he was declared AWOL. And then 30 days later, he is declared a deserter. His family, including his brother Carl, did not believe that whatsoever. This is not something that he would ever do. He had no reason to. And it would be simply by accident that Carl even found out that his brother's vehicle was found on August 17th, 1958. All the way in Death Valley, 500 miles away from Fort Ord. His brother found out through, I guess, someone who was stationed at Fort Ord who told the brother his car was found, but then the next day he told the brother, actually it's classified, I shouldn't have even told you that. You see, the thing is that the Army did not notify his family that he was missing. He never once told any of them. In this recreation, the family found out that they actually cleared out his room at Fort Ord the day that he disappeared, which is actually illegal for them to have done. The next of kin is legally required to be notified to collect belongings, but they didn't notify the next of kin. And so now the family has made his story public. Where is Paul? The family found out that there was a witness who saw Paul Whipkey's car driving past him on a road near Death Valley, and that the man behind the wheel of the car was wearing Army fatigues, which was strange because according to all witnesses, the day that Paul left the base, he was not wearing his fatigues. He was in his civilian clothes. When his car was found, a pile of cigarette butts was found right next to the car. Paul didn't smoke. He never smoked a day in his life. The car was not forensically analyzed. When Paul's car was found, you would think that would immediately get them to start searching everywhere for him. Nope. They waited not 1, not 2, not 3, 9 months to begin searching for him, the Army. The family also heard from Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, who was Paul's commanding officer, that he believes that there's no way Paul would have just abandoned his post. That it's insane to even declare him a deserter. But he would tell the family that the Army told him to stop asking questions, to not look into Paul's disappearance anymore. He would tell the family about an occurrence that happened starting in 1957. He noticed that Paul had been talking to these two men, this is a recreation obviously, in these suits. They weren't supposed to be on the base, so his commanding officer said, "Hey, what are you guys doing here? Can you show me your IDs?" Well, they produced IDs, but the ID did not state who they worked for. Well, later he would come to believe that these two men were from the CIA, and that they were potentially trying to recruit Paul Whipkey. In January of 1958, Paul told his commanding officer, who had witnessed all of this, that he was going to be going on an assignment, that he was going to make a name for himself. But he could not elaborate, he wasn't allowed to, on what that was. So there is this belief that Paul took an assignment with the CIA, because he was also spotted after he had disappeared at this place called the White's Motel. It's believed that maybe he had gone to this motel to meet with the CIA people to go over whatever assignments they gave him. And the theory is that Paul gave his car to the Army so that the Army could plant it in Death Valley to make it look like he was gone, or that so nobody would find it. But what makes me confused about that is, wouldn't the CIA, the Army, at some point begin to realize that we're going to have to explain to his family where he is? Like, if the Army knew he was with the CIA, we have to give him something, right? Carl, his brother, by 1977 tries to reach out to the FBI to get information with regards to his brother's case. The FBI tells him, "We've got nothing. Those files are destroyed." That's convenient. Then, another twist he discovered. Again, he's basically doing he's finding all this out himself. This was one of Paul's friends, Lieutenant Charles Guess. They served with each other at Camp Desert Rock and at Fort Ord. He was also stationed at Fort Ord at the same time that Paul was there when he disappeared. Well, 11 days after Paul's disappearance, Charles disappears. The two of them were good friends. He vanishes while flying a plane. Roughly a year later, a crash plane was found. It had crashed a little bit north of Death Valley. Within feet of the wreckage was the body of Lieutenant Charles Guess. But something strange was there as well. The serial number on the plane was completely different than the serial number of the plane he flew off in. Wasn't even remotely close to being the same plane. What happened to him? Then, in 1982, another major update. The Army Board of Correction of Military Records, they would hold a 3-day meeting. And in this meeting, they declared that Lieutenant Paul Whipkey died the day after he disappeared. On July 1st, 1982, the board announced that he had been killed in action. However, they have never released how he died. They've never released his body, or even if they have his body, because he's still never been found. The family doesn't have him, and he was given a record of honorable service. There are some that believe that he was killed during an atomic bomb testing incident, and that the army covered it up. But it doesn't explain how people saw him after he disappeared, once at a gas station and another time at a motel. It's believed that the guy who saw the car driving near Death Valley, that he didn't see Paul behind the wheel. He saw someone from the army driving the car to hide it. Sadly, his brother Carl died never knowing the truth. And the reality is nobody does. Was Lieutenant Charles Guest a part of this? Was he killed for reasons related to this? Was his body staged where it was? And was Paul Whipkey killed? Was he recruited by the CIA? What happened to Paul Whipkey? Unfortunately, given how old this case is, the sad truth is that this will likely remain an unsolved mystery forever. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Maria Reyes. Viewer discretion is advised. Unfortunately, I have very limited information on this case. Maria Pastora Reyes was born on March 19th, 1980, and at the time of this case, she was living in or near the Santa Ana, California area. The 21-year-old woman was last seen alive on January 3rd, 2002, sometime between the hours of 10:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. And she was observed leaving the 2300 block of West 6th Street in Santa Ana, California. She was observed walking in the direction of her home because she didn't have a car at the time, I guess, and her home at that time was in Garden Grove. At 6:45 a.m. on January 4th, 2002, her body was discovered. She was lying off the shoulder of Hellman Avenue and Pine Avenue, and that was in Chino, California. Maria had been stabbed to death, and so this was obviously ruled a homicide. I don't know if anything else occurred, like if she was sexually assaulted, I'm not sure. I don't know if anything was stolen. There is really a very small amount of info on her case. I do know that in that time frame, there were 4 men seen driving a 1990s brown Chevy van. It may look something like this. They were seen driving away from the field or the area where her body was found around the time frame that her body may have been dumped there. But at the same time, these people may have absolutely nothing to do with her case. They were all described as 4 Hispanic males. Here we are now in 2024, and her murder remains unsolved. Surely somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth and has got to know what happened to Maria that night. What led to her being stabbed numerous times and being dumped off the side of a road. Maria was somebody's daughter. She was somebody's granddaughter. She was probably somebody's niece. She was somebody's friend. She was a person. And her brutal homicide should not be forgotten because she still needs justice. If you know anything, you can report your information anonymously. You don't have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. So if you have any information on her murder, please call 909-387-3589. She would be murdered just a few hundred yards away from her home. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Mary Jo Frug. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Mary Jo Frug was a loving wife and mother to 2 children, and she was a professor here at the New England Law in Boston, in Massachusetts. Mary was also the founder of a group of women, female lawyers and people working in law, and their group was called the Femme Crits, and this is where her and her colleagues would do a lot of feminist work. There were a lot of people who did not agree with her viewpoints, and a lot of people agreed with her. But at the end of the day, Mary was still a very beloved member of the community. She was a great mom and a wonderful wife, and she was a pioneer. Mary and her husband lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they lived here on Spark Street. On the evening of April 4th, 1991, Mary Jo Frug would leave her home on Spark Street to walk just down the road to a convenience store to get a couple of groceries. The convenience store, I believe, was located somewhere here on Brattle Street. On her way to the convenience store, in front of Holy Trinity Armenian Church, someone walked up to Mary and just began to stab her. She had been stabbed numerous times directly in her chest that pierced her heart, and also a few times in her thigh. Her attacker just fled the scene. Mary was able to crawl a few feet before someone was able to see her and, go to help her. She was literally just 300 yards away from her front door. And sadly, Mary Jo Frug would be pronounced dead later that evening. At the crime scene, Mary's purse was located and nothing was stolen from it. Nothing was taken off of her body either, like jewelry or anything. So they knew robbery could not have been the motive, unless it was a robbery that just went really, really wrong. It's possible that they were planning to rob her, but then something happened where, a robber stabbed her and had to get out really quickly before taking anything because people would probably notice. They did find a knife somewhat near the scene. However, there was no forensic evidence on that knife to confirm whether or not it was used in Mary's murder or not. There were witnesses who saw a young white male, roughly a block, maybe a little bit less than a block away from where this happened, about 5'10" to 6 feet tall, late teens to maybe really early 20s. He had brown hair, he was dressed in dark clothing, and he was running away from the direction where the murder happened. There were shoe prints found, I guess, in the dirt nearby, and they did take castings of those shoe impressions, but they haven't led to anything. The investigation would take them to a potential motive that perhaps her work in feminist academic work may have been the reason why she was targeted. Because they do believe that Mary was targeted. This was intentionally meant for her. But people in her life, her family, her sons, her husband, her colleagues, all said that that was kind of a ridiculous idea. And all of the people who opposed her, who were against her, ideas, said we would rather just write a story saying how stupid she was or how wrong she was. We wouldn't kill her. But it doesn't mean that that wasn't necessarily the motive either. The truth of the matter is they don't know what the motive is. I mean, she wasn't sexually assaulted either. She was just walking down the street from her home to go get a couple of groceries. Someone walked up to her and stabbed her multiple times and then ran away. That's it. That's all there is. There has never been a suspect. There has never been a person of interest. They have almost no leads. They have virtually no evidence. They have no idea if the knife they found somewhat near the murder scene was even a part of this. They think a hunting style knife was used, but I don't know what the style of knife was that they found. Mary Jo Frug's murder is the epitome of an unsolved mystery because they have no idea why this happened. They have no clue who did it. They have absolutely nothing. They did offer at the time a $25,000 reward for any information that would help lead to her killer. And her killer is very likely still out there. This was 30-ish years ago. They may be in their 50s or 60s or possibly 70s, but they're very much could still be alive. And so somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the unsolved homicide of Mary Jo Frug, please call 617-349-3300. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Meghan Landowski. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Meghan Landowski was a 16-year-old girl living in Portsmouth, Virginia with her family. Meghan was a student at Woodrow Wilson High School. She also had one sister and one brother. Grew up in a very loving, very normal household. Meghan was described as that one teenager who basically, once you met her, you guys were friends. It was incredibly easy for her to socialize and to just be friends with people. The 16-year-old was also really skilled in martial arts, but the thing that she loved more than anything else was dancing. She was an incredibly talented dancer. Very graceful, very beautiful. But somewhere around her freshman year of high school, people began to notice that her demeanor was changing a little bit. Meghan seemed to be more reserved, quiet. She was starting to withdraw from her friends. And it was her stepfather, Chris Short, who kind of finally got Meghan to acknowledge what was bothering her. And it was horrible. So it was her stepfather's best friend, a man named Robert Hick. Well, Meghan told Chris that this Robert person had sexually abused her. He did so when she was 15 years old. Robert Hick himself was a married father to 4 kids. And eventually this would lead to a criminal proceedings, which would then eventually, the plan was to go to trial. But that would never happen. Because on the afternoon of April 10th, 2008, Meghan was murdered. Her stepfather, Chris, would walk into the home, and in the kitchen, in a pool of blood, he found his stepdaughter, Meghan. He calls 911. He tells them, my daughter is obviously had been sexually assaulted, and she is barely breathing. She's been stabbed. There were bloody shoe impressions near her body. The murder weapon was on the floor. It appeared the knife came from this butcher block here in the kitchen. Meghan would be pronounced deceased after the ambulance arrived. The police, during the investigation, determined that the killer entered through a window, a downstairs bedroom window. And based on the evidence at the crime scene, it appeared that the killer had forced Meghan upstairs to the bedroom, her bedroom. He bound her with tape and then sexually assaulted her. At some point, she gets away, gets to the kitchen, but he catches up to her and stabs her to death. By the way, the stepfather believed that she had been sexually assaulted because her underwear and her skirt had been taken off and thrown, and so she was partially nude when he found her. But the coroner would confirm that she was sexually assaulted. They found DNA at the crime scene. They found blood from the killer, and they also found male bodily fluid. And it was widely believed. The police began to investigate one person first, and that was Robert Hick, the man that was going to trial because she accused him of sexually abusing her. Well, now that she is gone, he can't go to trial because he has the right to confront his accuser, and if she's dead, that can't happen. So charges against him were dropped. But he became the suspect. And it was obvious to everyone he did this. But he willingly gave his DNA. He gave his shoes. The shoe impressions found were not his. They weren't the right size. But most importantly, the DNA found at the crime scene, DNA found in her and also with blood, was not his. And he, unbelievably, was cleared. Suspect after suspect comes up, and they clear every single one of them through DNA. They interviewed and took DNA from ex-boyfriends, from students at the school. Nearly 100 people volunteered their DNA, not a single match. Meghan's dance teacher would, down the road, host a memorial walk for her to remember her, but also to get possibly people to get information about what happened to her. And that's because of that, they actually ended up getting a tip about a certain student. A fellow student at the high school with her is a very talented young man. He was a violinist, very quiet, very unassuming kid. According to a bus driver, he tried to basically hit on Meghan, and it seemed like she rejected him. So police bring him in for questioning. They just want to ask him some questions, and they ask him, hey, can you give us your DNA? And he gives them, I guess, a wadded up piece of chewed gum, and they find out that the DNA on that gum wasn't a match to the crime scene. But they also found out that's because the DNA on the gum was from a female. Somehow, some way, he swapped the gum to give to police with someone else's gum. And so at that point, they're able to get get a warrant for actual DNA directly from him. And the DNA found on Meghan was his. And that's when he spins a story. He says he went to the house to talk to her that day, but when he entered through the downstairs bedroom window, he got up to Meghan's bedroom and saw that she was being accosted by a masked man holding a gun. This masked man with a gun forces him to have sex with Meghan. And then after they were done, the masked person stabbed Meghan, but for some reason left him untouched and then just fled the house. Obviously a complete bullshit story. I mean, that's an insane story, but props to him. When looking at his computer records, they found out that he had done a lot of Google searches for burglarizing homes and for raping women. They also found on his computer that he had photoshopped his picture over the face of a rapist that had been, caught and went to trial. That plus the DNA evidence and the shoe impressions, by the way, were his, same size, same shoes. He was arrested and charged with her murder. The evidence against him was completely and utterly overwhelming. He pleads guilty to first-degree murder, attempted rape, aggravated sexual battery, abduction, and statutory rape. He is sentenced to life in prison, and he can ask for parole after 42 years. And ultimately, they don't really know why exactly he decided to do this. He was this really good kid. He had a bright future ahead of him. But clearly there was a monster somewhere inside of him. And the likely reason is that Meghan rejected him. And well, men being men sometimes. But thankfully, Meghan and her family got the justice she very rightfully deserved. It's been 20 years and the question still remains, who put him in that grain silo? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Mont Highley IV. Viewer discretion is advised. Mont Highley, pictured here with his family, grew up in a really loving home. His father was a doctor, and they were always well taken care of. Throughout his school years, he would excel in sports like football. He loved being on the water, and he loved spending time with his family. The 33-year-old was described as a very kind, very loving young man. This is someone who would literally stop on the side of the road if people were out there collecting like trash and paper. He would get out of his car just to thank them for doing that. Mont was someone who just got along with everybody. It was just really easy to get along with him. Mont was the youngest of 3 siblings. He had 2 sisters that he got along with really, really well. And the family was just incredibly well respected in this community, which they lived in Montgomery, Alabama. It was Thanksgiving of 2003. The Highley family had their Thanksgiving dinner. It was a great evening. Mont was staying with his parents at their house for the Thanksgiving weekend, and he was initially scheduled to leave, I guess, a day or so later, but he ended up leaving a day early, and his mom recalls him on a phone call. She doesn't know who he was talking to, and she didn't really overhear the conversation at all, but it was from that conversation, I guess, that he decided to leave early. When he left the house, the plan was for him to go to one of his family's farms. And the plan was for him to meet his dad there the following afternoon because they were going to go hunting. And the farm was in Macon County, about 20 miles away from where the family's house was. So that afternoon, when his dad was supposed to meet him, his dad goes to that farm, but Mont isn't there. And Mont's vehicle also isn't there. So he kind of just assumes, oh, maybe he took off with someone. He'll be back a little bit later. He just forgot to tell me. When his dad got to the property, he also noticed that the gate was left open, which was unusual because Mont never did that. But then his dad gets a concerning phone call the following day after that. It's from a former judge named Dale Segrist. He tells Mr. Highley that I see Mont's car parked in front of my house, which was like, that was very weird. So Mont's dad goes to the judge's house and confirms that Mont's vehicle is there parked in front of the home. The key is still in the ignition, but Mont himself, nowhere to be found. In the vehicle, they also found a briefcase that Mont owned, and they also found his rifle. Plus, they found $200 in cash, and this was from $300 that his dad had given him about a week prior. So $100 was missing. So this retired judge and the family searches around their property to see if maybe Mont is there, but they have no luck. The parents then go to another one of their properties, which is about 30 miles away, to see if maybe he was there. He wasn't. But what was strange to them was that it was obvious that someone had slept in one of the beds there. It wasn't made. There were dishes in the sink, and it was the dishes of like one person. But again, Mont is nowhere to be found. So they go back to the farm where Mont was supposed to be, and they do a more thorough search. In the house, they found a pair of Mont's pants, and in his pocket was his cell phone. And the pants seemed to be a little wet for some reason. But now they were super concerned because that's why they couldn't get a hold of him on his cell phone. He didn't have it with him. They also found the remaining $100 in cash there at that property. So none of it had been stolen. So he was officially reported missing. The family spends a lot of money, a lot of resources in trying to find him. The searches for Mont were large. They had hundreds of people volunteer their time to help search. This is his dad during one of the searches. It got media coverage all over the place. And for like a month or so, they just had no luck. And then a discovery was made. January 14th, 2004. This is an unused grain silo, and it was located behind the Back 40 restaurant, which was on County Road 30 in Macon County. In that silo was the body of Mont Highley IV. All he had on was a t-shirt and nothing else. His body was badly decomposed, so they actually had to verify it was him through his dental records, which they did confirm. His body was so badly decomposed, however, that they were not able to determine exactly how he died. That being said, the police there have basically been investigating this as a homicide case, that Mont Highley IV was murdered and either dumped in that grain silo or maybe he was killed there. 1,000 people attended his funeral. That's how well loved he was. And then the investigation into his murder continued. Initially, the police said they had several leads that they were working on and they were confident that this was going to be solved. It hasn't been. His dad would later state that at least 3 different investigative units had worked on his case. And there's just some kind of unusual aspects to this, like his pants were found in the farm and they were kind of wet. Why? Why did he only have on a shirt in the grain silo? Why and how was his vehicle parked right in front of a judge's house? And most importantly, how exactly did he die and who did it to him? Unfortunately, that is a question that still remains to this very day. It has been now 21 years. Surely someone somewhere out there has got to know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the murder of Mont Highley IV, please call 334-676-7870. Help him get the justice he rightfully deserves. A young Indigenous girl vanished in 2021, and there has been no sign of her ever since. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Nevaeh Kingbird. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time this case occurred, Nevaeh Lee Kingbird is 15 years old. She is an enrolled member of the Red Lake Nation, and she's living in the Bemidji, Minnesota area. Sadly, earlier in the year when this case occurred, she had lost one of her closest friends because her friend had ended their own life. And, so times were hard for her. Nevaeh is a well-loved individual. She has always been, a really good, well-behaved kid. She loved going to school. She loved playing volleyball. And then suddenly one day, she was just gone. On October 21st, 2021, Nevaeh would tell her mom that she was going to go to the movies with some friends. Apparently, her and her friends had actually gone to a party that night, and they ended up getting kicked out of that party. And the party that they were at was in Cass Lake. After they were kicked out of it, they would end up going back to Nevaeh's home because her mom was at work. When her mom got home, her mom, noticed there were people there, and so she kicked them out. And Nevaeh actually also ended up running out the back door of the house. According to her sister, Nevaeh had then gone to another friend's house. They had climbed, in the window of her friend's home, but then when the friend's stepdad got home, Nevaeh got nervous, and so she jumped back out the window. And she took off. When her friend, within, moments, looked out the window, she couldn't see Nevaeh, and at that point, nobody has seen her ever since. Nevaeh was last seen by her friend leaving the house at about 2 o'clock in the morning, now on the morning of October 22nd, 2021. Nevaeh is 5'4", approximately 120 pounds. She, at the time, had black hair with blonde highlights. I believe she may have been wearing a red sweatshirt with the Chicago Bulls label on it, and also a pair of jeans. Once Nevaeh never got home, they would end up kind of trying to figure out where the heck she went. And that's when they discovered that her cell phone was still at the home that she had jumped out the window of. That's where her cell phone still was. So it wasn't with her anymore. And then when they report her missing, at first it's kind of like this belief that she's a runaway, she's 15, she'll come back. The yada 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 thing we always hear all the time. Police not taking it seriously. Nevaeh had nothing with her. She didn't have her cell phone, she didn't have any money, she had not any of her belongings whatsoever. Nevaeh and her sister had run away from their home before. They always came back, and whenever Nevaeh had run away, she always brought her stuff with her. But that didn't happen this time. The day she was reported missing, there was a very brief search by police, but the first actual thorough search for her was not done until December. It has gotten to a point where volunteers had volunteered their time to go looking for her. They have searched the woods from top to bottom, and they have yet to find a single solitary trace of her. No clothing, nothing. They have even searched the local bodies of water, and they have found nothing and no one. They have since done these very extensive grid searches to try to find her. Again, nothing. Nevaeh's sister has since decided to change her career paths because of what happened to her sister. She is in school. She's studying law enforcement. She intends to go to law school. She intends to do something to make sure that Indigenous women cases and young children's cases are highlighted just as much as anyone else's. Because as we all know, they currently are not. Because ultimately what it comes down to is that just enough isn't done for them when there is plenty done for non-Indigenous people. Nevaeh was a 15-year-old kid. This was now several years ago and no sign of her. Something had to have happened to her, but what? Did she injure herself and succumb to the environment, to the elements? Did somebody take advantage of her, saw her trying to hide or run, and kidnapped her? Did she very successfully run away? The odds of that are probably pretty low. I mean, given today's world and technology, it's really difficult, especially for a 15-year-old kid, to just make yourself vanish. There is a Facebook page dedicated to Nevaeh Kingbird's case, and somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Nevaeh Kingbird on that night in 2021. You can report your information anonymously. You don't have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Nevaeh Lee Kingbird, please contact the Bemidji Police Department at 218-333-9111. Body part after body part of the same victim would be found separately over the course of 6 months. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Oak Grove Jane Doe. Viewer discretion is advised. It was April 12, 1946, along the Willamette River near Oak Grove, Oregon. 3 people would find a burlap sack floating in the water. When they opened it, they found a human torso. In that same burlap sack, they also found several items of clothing. There was also weights thrown into the sack, probably to help weigh it down in the water. The following day, April 13th, another burlap sack is found, this time near Willamette Falls. There was a right thigh and 2 arms, and they determined they belonged to the victim of the torso, and they were able to confirm that this was the body of a woman. 3 months later, July of 1946, another burlap sack is found floating in a body of water. This time, it was the right thigh of a woman. A few days later, July 29th, 1946, near the Clackamas River, a burlap sack was found with women's clothing. These are the clothing items that were found in the burlap sack, amongst the actual burlap sacks as well. September 1946, a fragment of a human scalp was found, also near Willamette Falls. October 1946, a small package was found close to the location where the torso was found. The severed head of a woman was found. All of these body parts, they all belonged to the same victim. The things that were missing from the victim were both of her hands and both of her feet. They had separately been severed off from the arms that were found and the thighs that were found. The coroner would find that on some of the body parts, they found these scorch marks that looked like they came from some kind of blowtorch maybe, giving them the reason to believe that this woman was tortured before she was killed. Her skull had severe blunt force trauma. They do believe that's likely how she died, but there were no indications of like stab marks on her bones or anything like gunshot wounds or anything. And then she was dismembered post-mortem, thrown into several different burlap sacks, and then disposed of in at least 2 different rivers. The initial coroner's report stated that the victim was likely in her late teens or early 20s, but then another medical examiner would look at the body, and they determined that the victim was likely middle-aged, possibly somewhere around 50 or older. So that created so many, like a flood of phone calls coming in. Oh, I think it's this person, I think it's that person, because they weren't able to narrow down exactly how old this person was. Now, it was determined that the woman, the victim, wore dentures, indicating she may have been an older woman. There was some speculation that the woman may have been the missing woman Anna Schrader. She was having an affair with a police lieutenant. In 1929, apparently the 2 of them had some sort of argument where a gunshot was fired, and he ended up breaking several of her ribs. By April of 1946, Anna Schrader was missing. She hadn't been seen for like a month or 2, which completely lines up with the time frame as to when the torso was first found. There are people who have seen the remains who believe there is a strong comparison between Anna and these remains. However, this connection has never been substantiated. The case was reopened in 2004, and they discovered that at that point, all of the evidence was gone. Most of the body parts were lost. They believe that the body parts were lost at some point during the mid to late 50s. The dentures, all of it, gone. And so now all they have is a story. A woman of unknown age, found murdered by blunt force trauma. Her body part was torn apart by a saw and then disposed of in a river. She was treated like bags of garbage. Unfortunately, without any evidence left, the identity of the woman will likely remain unknown forever. And who did this to her and how she ended up in several different burlap sacks, may remain a mystery forever. Murdered inside of his own home, and police and his family are still searching for answers. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Raymond Butch Weed. Viewer discretion is advised. Raymond Weed, who would go by Butch to everyone, he was the third of 5 total siblings and was born in Middletown, Connecticut. Butch, pictured here with his 2 nephews, was an incredibly devoted family man. Anytime someone in his family needed help, he was there in an instant. He would help friends, family, and neighbors. He worked in home renovation, and he was amazing at it. Butch always dreamed of having a child of his own, and in the interim, he would help raise his wife's son from a previous marriage. But by 2001, Butch and his wife did get a divorce. Now at this time, Butch is living in Wilton, which is in Maine. A pretty, small, peaceful little community. And on December 23rd, 2003, just days before Christmas, he would be discovered brutally murdered inside of his own home. It was about 7:30 in the morning when a couple of friends would go to his home to give him some Christmas presents. Police did not release his cause of death, but this is being treated as a homicide investigation. They believe he was likely killed the night prior between 5:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. I guess he had left a restaurant or someplace called Mario's and then headed straight home. It wouldn't be until 2004 when police would finally release his cause of death. Butch had been shot to death. Police said there is a possibility that this could have been some sort of robbery gone wrong, that somebody may have expected Butch to have a lot of money into his home but realized he didn't, and maybe they shot and killed him out of anger or because he walked in on it. But it's just a theory. They also interviewed several of his co-workers to see if maybe he had made anyone mad at that time. They had canvassed the neighborhood, they had gone door to door, they had been interviewing hundreds and hundreds of people, but they have not gotten any closer to figuring out who shot and killed this man. Police have stated that this has been a very difficult case to investigate right from the get-go. Because they didn't find the murder weapon, they did search bodies of water, especially near his home, and they found nothing. They had no clue what the motive was. It could be potentially many motives, but they can't narrow it down to any one in particular. Hundreds of people in his life, and nothing has come to the surface that would indicate why this may have happened. They have no suspects, not that they've named publicly, no persons of interest that they've named publicly. But somebody got into his house that night and shot and killed him, and that person remains free. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Butch Weed. His family deserves answers, and Butch and his family deserve justice. If you have any information on the murder of Raymond Butch Weed, please contact the Maine State Police at 207-624-7076. You can report your information anonymously. Please, if you have any information, please come forward. In this spot, a young man was gunned down and his killer still roams free. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Richard McDougal. Viewer discretion is advised. This case occurred here in St. Augustine, Florida back in 1990. 23-year-old Richard McDougal was out with his friend, a man named George Farley. They had been eating at a place called the Shrimp Haven Lounge, which I can't find a photo of that because it actually ended up turning into a Theo's restaurant. But they were after they left here, they were going to be walking, and this would have been going through downtown, I guess, to go to the Tradewinds Bar, which that was on Charlotte Street in St. Augustine. During their walk, they come across a building that is, back then, the Barnett Bank. When Richard and his friend got into some kind of verbal argument with a complete stranger somewhere along this walk. The two men would cross the street hoping to get away from this person that the argument was with. And while the friend, Mr. Farley, made it across the street, Richard McDougal basically continued to confront this man who was arguing with them. Over what exactly, I'm not sure. Mr. Farley made it about a half a block away. He was trying to yell to Richard, please stop, just come with me, it's not worth it. And about a half a block away, he hears a gunshot. When he turns around, he sees his friend Richard has fallen to the ground, and he sees the man who shot him running down the street. 2 more witnesses would also state they saw a man running from where this occurred. And no, if you're wondering, like, oh, maybe it was his friend, Mr. Farley, it wasn't. So this is one of the detectives who is currently working on this case, and she is standing essentially in the precise area where Richard McDougal fell to the ground and collapsed. Unfortunately, he would be pronounced deceased at the scene. All three witnesses, one of them including Mr. Farley, Richard's friend, said they saw the man running through this breezeway, which was near Flagler College. The suspect is described as a white male between 5 feet 9 inches tall to 6 feet tall, weighing approximately 160 to 170 pounds with blondish brown hair. Back then in 1990, he was believed to be about 20 to maybe 25 years old. The man was wearing blue jeans and a green or green plaid CPO style jacket. So obviously now if that man is still alive, he would be in his 50s approximately. But his killer has never been caught. The friend and the two witnesses did not recognize the man, and they gave descriptions to police, but I can't find any composite drawings of him. And again, what the argument was about, I'm not sure. But regardless of what that argument may have been about, it certainly didn't warrant this guy shooting and killing Richard, this young 23-year-old dude. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about who pulled that trigger and who shot and killed Richard McDougall. And perhaps that someone is you. You can report your information anonymously if you need to. So if you have any information, please call 888-277-8477. This man said, quote, "Okay, you got me. The gig's up. It's a body. If you want to recover the rest of her, it's in my freezer." Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Rory Haish and Candace Fitzpatrick. Viewer discretion is advised. It was September 11th, 2017. In Oshawa, Ontario, Canada, at a nearby harbor, the torso of a human was found. The remains were in such bad condition that they were next to impossible to identify. They had a tattoo on them, but it was really, really hard to distinguish what it was. 2 months later, in December of 2017, police were called to this home. It was the home of a man named Adam Strong. They were called there because there was someone else living in the same building, and there was a really foul odor coming from the pipes, and the pipes appeared to be clogged. So when the people living in the upper floor of this building called a plumber, the plumber removed what was in the clog, and it was a nightmare. They found human flesh, fingers, and human hair attached to the flesh. There were also human bone fragments. When police knocked on Adam Strong's basement door, this guy here, he told them, "Okay, you got me. The gig is up. If you want to recover the rest of her, she's in the freezer." And there were human remains in his freezer. In the freezer was a human head and various other body parts. The remains would soon be identified as belonging to 18-year-old Rory Haish. She had disappeared a few months prior. They would also soon realize that the torso that they found in the harbor belonged to her. To make matters worse, Rory was pregnant at the time she was killed. Rory was born in July of 1999. She was always considered a very bright and very talented young woman. She did well in school. She was really great at dancing. She did fall into some hard times, though, when she was about 15 or 16 years old. Fell into a life of drug use and stuff like that, and she had at one point run away from home. She had last been seen leaving a hospital after, having a conversation with her constable, and somehow, some way, she came across the house of Adam Strong. Adam Strong, basically, he admitted, he is right there at the door when he answered it for the first time. "You got me. I did it. Her head's in the freezer." And so, obviously, they would search his house more thoroughly. They found blood all over the place, like dried blood all over because he lived in the basement portion. And in his home, they found this knife, and it had, blood, dried blood, and there was skin cells on it. Now, the DNA they ran did not belong to Rory Haish. In fact, it belonged to another girl who had been missing for 10 years. Her name was Candace Fitzpatrick. I was watching an interview where her dad or her family, they searched so long for her, holding out hope that she was somewhere out there alive. And when they found out the news that her blood was found inside the basement of a now known murderer's home, that obviously was absolutely devastating. However, her body was not found in the house. Adam Strong, in his interrogations, he was very nonchalant. It's sort of unsettling. He was just very matter-of-fact. When they asked him, how did you meet Candace Fitzpatrick? He's like, "Oh, God, I can't remember. That was 10 years ago. I don't remember how I met her." He's just so, flippant about all of it. But he also isn't denying doing it. So obviously he is arrested and he is charged with 2 counts of murder. They did not have Candace's body, but they had enough evidence to essentially confirmed that she had likely been killed. And she had no business being in his home unless he had her in there and did something to her. There's no reason her blood should have been found on a knife in his home. His defense team did not present a case where they're like, oh, he's innocent, you got the wrong guy. They essentially are saying it was him, he did this. But he was mentally unwell, mentally ill. And also, you don't have actual evidence that he committed it. You do have evidence that he dismembered their bodies and stored their body, or one of their bodies, in his home, but you don't have proof that he killed them. Right, okay. Anyway, after a psychiatric evaluation, they determined that, no, he was mentally, well when he did this. He knew what he was doing. He knew to dismember the body. He knew to hide the body. So 2 girls, 10 years apart, he somehow lured each one of them into his home. Somehow, some way, he immobilized them, and he tortured them. They had evidence with Rory Haish's body that this was not a quick and painless death for her. This was a very brutal end. The guy's a fucking monster. And just so beyond disturbing. The evidence against him was so overwhelming. There was no chance in hell he was getting off. And he would be found guilty of both murders. And he was sentenced to life in prison. A few years later, and Adam Strong apparently offers to give up where he put Candace Fitzpatrick's body. He points them to the general area where he believes he put her, and unbelievably, they found her. And it sounds like these were partial remains, but they were at least finally able to lay her to rest properly. And in the end, both girls got the justice they rightfully deserved. They had the right guy the entire time, but it took decades to finally convict him. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Sonia Herrick Stone. Viewer discretion is advised. Sonia Herrick Stone was born on May 27th, 1951, and she was born in Quebec, Canada. But by the time this case happens, she had actually already moved to the Carmel-by-the-Sea area in California. She had at one point been married to this man here, Michael Stone, and they did have a child together. And when this case occurred, their daughter is 4 years old. However, things did not really work out with Michael, and so the two of them would end up separating. And so by this point, Sonia is here living in this house by herself with her daughter. Sonia was well-loved. She was an amazing mom. She had a big personality and just seemed to be a very happy-go-lucky individual. But then one day, someone would absolutely brutalize her and take her away from the world. It was October 15th, 1981. Sonia's 4-year-old daughter was at school. A friend would go to her house to, just meet up with Sonia. When she got there, she saw that Sonia's car was parked in the driveway, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary outside the house. But when the friend walked in, it was a different story. The friend walked in and found Sonia lying on the floor near the front door, deceased. Sonia had her own pantyhose wrapped around her neck, and so ultimately her cause of death was strangulation. There was evidence of a struggle, but nothing really appeared to be stolen, and the motive here was likely sexual assault. And they also noticed that her fingernail had some blood underneath it, and they determined that she likely scratched her attacker. She fought like hell, but unfortunately, she did not win the fight. One of the first suspects they looked at was, of course, the now ex-husband. Police felt that he was not being super cooperative, and they felt that made him look guilty. However, they were able to determine that he had a very valid, substantiated alibi. They know that he could not have committed this murder. Now, living just across the street from Sonia was this man, Michael Scott Glazenbrook. Police, while talking to him, because they were just talking to all of the neighbors and to see if anyone saw or heard anything, noticed that on his right cheek, he had a very fresh, very deep scratch. I'm not really sure what his explanation was to police as to why he had that scratch. But with Sonia having that blood underneath her fingernail, indicating she scratched her attacker, it was kind of like putting two puzzle pieces together there. However, back at this time, because again, this is in 1981, DNA technology really wasn't a thing yet. It was still a couple of years away from becoming an actual thing that they would use all the time. His alibi seemed to kind of switch back and forth, and ultimately, he became their prime suspect. His story kept changing. He had the scratch on his face. He did not really have a solid alibi, and so eventually he was arrested and he was charged with Sonia's murder. He goes on trial, but unfortunately, the prosecution was not able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the jury did not acquit him. They had a hung jury, 9 votes to 3, meaning that it was a mistrial, which also meant that he can be retried. Double jeopardy does not apply because he was not acquitted. And for decades, he remained the primary suspect. Finally, in 2020, this is like 4 decades later, a cold case team would reopen Sonia's case, and they would retest DNA. This included DNA found underneath her fingernail. They also found DNA on, I guess, a portion of her chest, which again, back in 1981, they really couldn't do much with. But now, you can do a whole lot with it. They were able to establish the same profile was underneath her nail and also on her chest. Came from the same male contributor. And because they now had his DNA on file, they compared it to Michael Glazenbrook's DNA. It was a match. The guy they knew the entire time for 40 some odd years that did this, now they had proof. So he is once again arrested and charged with Sonia's murder. This time, they have his DNA. And according to him, he never went into that house. So a jury, this time, thankfully finds him guilty. He was found guilty of murder and also of rape charges. He would be sentenced to life in prison without parole. It may have taken decades to finally get the guy, but finally, Sonia and her family got the justice she rightfully deserved. This man has been wanted by the FBI since 1980. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tanya Koprick. Viewer discretion is advised. Tanya, pictured here, had immigrated from Yugoslavia in 1975 and moved to Kansas City, Missouri. And she would attend the University of Missouri. By 1980, she meets and starts to date this man here, Richard Bockledge. He is 11 years younger than she is. The two of them hit it off right away, and within a few months, they are living together in the same apartment. And then about 6 months into the relationship, Richard proposes to her and she says yes. Tanya's friends were not exactly keen on Richard. They did not really feel like he was the best fit for her, but she was happy, and so they were happy for her. Now, when they met, Richard was studying pharmacy at the University of Missouri. But 6 months into this relationship, he begins to stop going to class and he begins spending more and more time with Tanya, which would eventually cause the school to drop him, which made him mad. He became demanding to Tanya because I guess she had connections with the administration's department there at the school. You need to do something about this. You need to get me back into school. But Tanya said, no, you've been missing school. She didn't ask him to spend all that time with her. She wanted him to be in school as well, but he just didn't want to. But then he got mad when he got basically kicked out. At that point, she began to notice that Richard had severe mood swings. He had a bit of a temper. He was very combative. And so Tanya essentially says, I'm calling off the engagement. We can't do this. On September 2nd, 1980, she officially breaks up with him and also kicked Richard out of the school. 2 weeks after this, Richard just walks back into school and starts attending his classes as if he hadn't been kicked out of school. But the administration and the staff is like, you can't be here. You're not a student here anymore. And that causes him to lash out at them. He gets mad at them. On September 18th, 1980, he manages to convince, I guess, the administration's board to review the incidents that would cause him to get kicked out of school. And they ended up saying with what they initially ruled, that he was no longer a student at that school. He leaves the school in a huff. Then he comes back about an hour or so later. Faculty sees him roaming the halls carrying one of these big envelopes that they believe he had a gun in. He was very agitated, walking the halls, asking, where's the dean? Where's the dean? They believed that he was likely looking for the dean to shoot and kill him. But he never found the dean, and he left the school. 3 hours later, Tanya pulls into her parking spot at her apartment complex. This is a recreation, TikTok, calm down. And he casually walks up to her car as she's getting out and fires his weapon at her. He shot her 3 times directly, point blank in her head. And he used a .45 automatic pistol to do so, and then he fled. There was a witness who saw this happen, and I think there's actually 2 witnesses. They both confirmed that the shooter was Richard Bockledge. It was without a shadow of doubt. So an immediate manhunt begins, because now he is a murderer on the run. On September 24th, Richard's 1975 Oldsmobile was found 900 miles away in Canada. And there were people who were witnesses to this, him parking the car there, that confirmed again that it was Richard Buckledge based on photos that they were shown. 2 months after the murder occurred, Tanya's family receives a letter. In the letter, he stated that Tanya was executed and that her murder was necessary and also inevitable. The FBI became involved because he had essentially fled the United States, and they put, interstate flight, capital murder on him. But here's the thing. Richard Buckledge has never been seen since. No signs of this man, ever. No one in Canada, no one in the States. I mean, there were rumblings here and there that people think they might have seen him. There were rumors that he was committing minor crimes across the country, like robberies and stuff like that, but I don't believe there's any other murders connected to him. At the time of the murder and his disappearance, Richard Buckledge was 6 foot tall. He was 170 pounds. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He also has surgical scars running vertical under each of his underarms. He was 23 years old at the time the murder happened. If alive today, Richard Buckledge would be 67 years old, and he may look something similar to this. There have been no reported sightings of him. There is, of course, speculation that maybe he ended his own life, but also he could still very well be alive. If you recognize this man, or this man, what he may have looked like back in 1980, you are asked to contact the FBI. You can call the Kansas City FBI office at 816-512-8200. Again, he may look like this today. If you know where he is, please come forward. Was she the girl in the mysterious Polaroid picture? That is a mystery that still remains to this very day. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Tara Calico. Viewer discretion is advised. Tara Calico was born on February 28, 1969, and she was born and raised in New Mexico. It's pretty much where she spent her whole life. At the time this case occurred, she is 19 years old. She is attending college, and Tara is described as an incredibly extroverted, very outgoing person. She would be kind of like the life of the party type person. She was very physically active. She loved to do bike rides. She was incredibly intelligent. She always seemed to have a book in her hand, and she was going to college to possibly work in the psychiatry field. And at the time this case occurred, she was working as a bank teller. And then one day, she vanished. And Tara has never been seen since. It was September 20th, 1988 at 9:30 a.m. Tara will get on her mom's pink bike and go out for her daily bike ride. It was usually about a 2-hour bike ride. She used to do that ride with her mom, but her mom stopped doing the bike rides because there was, I guess, unsavory characters potentially stalking them. And her mom tried to get Tara to stop, doing the bike rides, but Tara said, I want to keep doing them. So her mom said, well, get Mace. But she left the home around 9:30 a.m. and Tara would tell her mom, hey, if I'm not back in 2 hours, come look for me, because she had plans that afternoon. 2 hours came and went, and Tara didn't come home. Her mom immediately gets into her vehicle and drives the normal route that Tara would take on the bike. She doesn't find her. And then a couple hours later, she reports her missing. Police get involved. The bike is never found. They searched the long stretch of road that Tara would typically go on. I guess it was New Mexico State Road 47. They found potentially some bike tracks, but again, no bike. And they didn't find any sign of Tara. No clothing, no sign of a struggle anywhere along the road. They did, however, find a Walkman and a cassette tape. Not this actual one, but it was confirmed to be a cassette tape that Tara had brought with her. Her mom thought that possibly Tara dropped those on purpose to leave a trail. But unfortunately, the tape and the Walkman didn't lead them to anything. This is the stretch of road where Tara was last observed by witnesses who were driving that road at the same time. Now, one witness would state that they saw Tara on her bike, and following very closely behind was a pickup truck that looked like this, and it had a camper on it. It was an old 1953-1955 Ford truck, light in color. And behind the wheel, one of the witnesses saw a man who looked somewhat like this. Obviously, they didn't get the greatest look at him, so this is the best that they can come up with. Many people saw her on the road, but nobody witnessed what actually happened to her. At least, nobody that's technically come forward. The parents didn't receive any ransom notes. They had really no idea who would have done this to her, or what was even done to her. They had to hold out hope that she was still alive. So one of the witnesses would state that in that pickup truck was at least one person for sure, but possibly up to 2 or 3 people in that truck. One of the individuals was apparently the son of a local law enforcement officer there, and that this was an 18-year-old kid, which this certainly does not look like an 18-year-old. But many years later, witnesses would come forward to state that they think they know what happened to her, that these people in this pickup truck were following closely behind her and were trying to grab her from the vehicle. And then eventually they ran into her on the bike, knocking her off of it and injuring her pretty bad. And in a panic, they ended up killing her and then threw her body into, I guess, a pond or a lake nearby, and then took the bike to some sort of like junkyard and got rid of it. Some rumors state that the men kidnapped her, raped her, and then killed her. They would also get tips that Tara was abducted by someone else and she had been raped and stabbed to death. One person says that she was buried under a whole bunch of concrete. One other witness says she was put into a freezer. Police have used these tips to search certain areas for her, but they've never found her. They've dug, they've looked everywhere that they got a tip that she may have been. They didn't find her. And so ultimately, it sounds like the police were just being messed with, unfortunately. But the information about the son of the influential police officer or law enforcement officer there in town, that one seems to be the most credible, or the ones that they have actually looked into the most. Well, that individual, the son of the local law enforcement officer, died at the age of 21, just a few years after Tara's disappearance. He died in an apparent suicide / playing Russian roulette situation, but his dad believes he was murdered. And then in 1989, this photo surfaced in Florida. It was found in the parking lot of a convenience store in Port St. Joe, Florida. It depicts, and I know a lot of you have seen this, I actually shared this photo the other day in another video discussing who this boy may potentially be, but this stirred up a lot. And now this photo is very infamous, especially around, the internet true crime world. There were people who believed truly that the young woman featured here was Tara. It sparked a debate about, who were these two individuals. So I guess Scotland Yard at one point got a hold of the Polaroid and compared it to Tara's images. And Scotland Yard would say that they believed that that was Tara Calico in that photo. But then the FBI took a look at it and they were inconclusive with regards to whether it was her or not. And then I guess a third source looked at the photo and said it definitely isn't her. And in the end, it kind of became more of a distraction than anything. The identities of these two individuals has never been confirmed. They don't know if this was real or if this was some sort of staged photo. It's a mystery, and whether or not that girl is Tara also remains a mystery. Tara's case has been looked at several times over the years. And then finally, in 2023, police in New Mexico came out with a breakthrough. They said that they now have enough evidence to go forth to the DA to get an indictment for a possible suspect who they think killed her. That was back in 2023, but I don't see any updates since then. And because the court documents in terms of the suspect or suspects, they were sealed, and so their names have not been announced publicly. I don't know if it was the son of that particular officer. I mean, obviously he's dead now, but maybe he was included in it, but then other people were also included in it who were still alive. I don't know. What police do know is that Tara Calico was likely abducted. She had gone on that bike ride almost every day. Someone may have known that and had been stalking her. I mean, her mother did say that there was someone they thought was stalking them on the road, but who that person is unknown. You also have this couple witnesses who saw this pickup truck with a camper driving closely behind her, but then these people didn't see the actual abduction. They didn't know anything wrong was about to happen. Was the son of that police officer in that vehicle, or was he not? Sadly, both of Tara's parents have since passed away. They never found out where their daughter was. They never found out what happened to her. They never got the answers. But Tara's sister has taken over the reins from Tara's mom, because Tara's mom was on this like every single day. She was fighting to the last breath to get her daughter back and to get her justice. And so now more family has picked up the torch and continued going on with it. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what exactly happened to Tara that day and where she is. And that person might be you. You can report your information anonymously. You do not have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. If you have any information on the disappearance of Tara Calico, please contact the Albuquerque FBI office at 505-889-1300. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Carolyn and John Tarwicki. Viewer discretion is advised. Carolyn and John lived here in this home, which was located in Howard Township in Michigan. And simply put, Carolyn and John were like one of the happiest married couples you'd ever see. They were quite the perfect pair. They did everything together. They were madly in love with one another. They loved, being goofy and making people laugh. And they were good, kind people. And then one day, someone took all of that from the world. It was February 5th, 2010. Carolyn and John worked for a company called Blessing Music Company. I believe that's where they would supply and sell musical instruments. They showed up to work every single day. They never called off. They never showed up late. But on that February 5th, 2010 day, they did not show up to work. This immediately threw red flags up to their coworkers. So they would go to the house. As they approach the house, they see footsteps basically leading up to it. And then they see footsteps on the other side of the house of someone walking away from it. But when they entered the home, they found Carolyn and John. They had both been murdered. John had been stabbed 10 times and also shot. Carolyn had been beaten, stabbed 4 times, and shot. At that time, however, they were not able to recover any of the murder weapons. However, 2 months later, I guess found deep in a freezer inside the Tarwicki home, one of the family members would end up finding a large knife. That knife had dried blood on it, which would later come back to being John and Carolyn's blood. So they have finally found the murder weapon. It was in the house the entire time. The police did canvass the neighborhood. They also went door to door, talked to neighbors, talked to coworkers, family, and eventually they would come across a name. And that was the name Keith Lintz. Keith had run-ins with the law. He was known for committing robberies, and they believe that the motive here in this case was definitely robbery. They think that this was a robbery gone wrong. So when they questioned him and talked to him, he said, I didn't have anything to do with that. I have an alibi. I was at work. They actually would talk to his mom, and his mom confirmed his alibi. And even with the knife being found 2 months later, they still didn't have physical evidence tying him to the case. However, they would find out from a witness that he confessed indirectly to committing both murders. But that still wasn't enough. And that's when they found out that Keith's childhood friend, a man named Shane Zimmerman, was in prison. They asked him, are you willing to wear a wire and see if you could get him to confess to the murders? He agreed. And in that conversation between Keith and Shane, he admitted to killing the Tarwicki couple. He said he had gotten into a humongous fight with his mom that night, and he stormed out. He was having issues with money, and so he wanted to rob someone. He came across the Tarwicki home, and he thought it was empty, but he could probably go in there and steal some things. But what he didn't realize was that the couple was home. And he said that he had killed them both just instinctively. That he was not expecting them to be home, but they surprised him. And so he just reacted by shooting them. And then after they were incapacitated, he beat and stabbed them until they were dead. So Keith Lintz was finally arrested in 2012. The shoe impressions found outside the home leading away and to the house, well, they didn't have the exact shoes, but they did know the shoe size. It was his exact shoe size, and it was not a match to the shoe size of either Carolyn or John. But they didn't have any truly solid physical evidence. It relied heavily on his own admission on this when he was, talked to by his friend Shane. It was recorded. They also would call to the stand the other witness who said he indirectly confessed to the murders before he had talked to Shane. So they had 2 confessions, basically. They also discovered that he lied. He was not at work during the time these murders happened. They also found out that his mom lied about the alibi. So his whereabouts, as a matter of fact, were not known, meaning he could have been at the Tarwicki house. And the jury agreed with the prosecution. They found Keith Lintz guilty of both counts of murder and also of robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. and a happy, loving couple is lost forever. All because a man wanted to steal some things because he was mad. And instead of just running away from the house, he decided to murder this couple. I hope every day for him in prison is the worst day possible. She has been missing for almost 2 months, and the police and her family are hoping somebody knows something. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Teresa Kowalczyk. Viewer discretion is advised. Teresa, who also goes by Terry, is 62 years old, and she is from the Roland, Arkansas area. Teresa's mother says she last saw her daughter on November 8th, 2024. I'm filming this on January 1st, 2025, so it's been almost 2 months. After not hearing from Teresa for a couple of days, they go to her home and she does not appear to be there. From what I understand, her purse was found inside the home, but Teresa was not. I don't have a lot of specifics about this, unfortunately, but Teresa would officially be reported missing to the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department on November 11th, 2024. Teresa was last seen wearing blue and white striped t-shirt and blue jeans, and she may have left her home on foot. She has dark hair, brown eyes, she's about 5'5" and approximately 180 pounds. Teresa is an incredibly kind-hearted and loving person, that she has a really good heart for people. And her mom, her family, they just want her home. They want to know where she is, what happened to her, and still hoping for the best. It doesn't sound like she had a cell phone on her either, so they can't track that particular aspect of it. I don't know if there were any signs of a struggle inside the home. There's really very little published about it, but somebody out there has got to know where Teresa is and what happened to her, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have information but don't want to say who you are, you can report information anonymously. The family just wants her home. That's the biggest thing. So if you have any information on the disappearance of Teresa Kowalczyk, please reach out to the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department at 501-340-6963. The image you see here might be the image of a man who shot and killed a gun control advocate. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Thomas Wales. Viewer discretion is advised. Thomas Wales was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1952. He would later become a father, and a great one at that. He would go on to become a Harvard graduate, and then ended up getting his law degree, which would then lead him to becoming an assistant United States attorney in Seattle, Washington. He was a prosecutor. Thomas primarily specialized in fraud. In 1995, someone entered the high school that one of his sons attended, and this person brought in a gun and shot 2 people and injured them. This would quickly prompt Thomas Wales to become an advocate for gun control. He became involved with Washington ceasefire, and he was one of the most vocal supporters of a 1997 state's referendum that would require gun owners to use trigger locks, but unfortunately that referendum failed. But he would eventually become the president of the ceasefire group. On October 11th, 2001, his life came to a very tragic end. Based on witness accounts, they believe that about 10:40 p.m. on that day, somebody fired 2 shots into his home from outside, and the shots would go through a window. Both shots came into contact with Thomas Wales as he sat at his computer. Now, this killer knew to avoid the security lights or triggering the security lights outside his home, almost suggesting that this person knew the layout. But Thomas was shot once through his neck and once through his chest. Neighbors who heard the gunshots called 911 and police arrived, and Thomas was still alive. But he would be rushed to a hospital, and unfortunately they were not able to save him. He passed away roughly a day later. Witnesses in the neighborhood saw a man who looked like this running from the house, or at least running down the street from the house. And this identity was confirmed by, I believe, at least 2 or 3 people. And so they do believe that this man here is the person responsible for shooting him. But this man has never been identified. They believe that the shooter used a Makarov pistol, one very similar to this. The gun itself was not recovered, and I guess it was likely fit with some kind of illegal barrel. There were shell casings left behind, but those shell casings have not revealed any physical evidence. I guess at one point, police, while investigating this case, found an airline pilot that Thomas had prosecuted at one point, who just so happened to be an extreme firearms enthusiast. And they believe that he may have been a suspect in this. However, they investigated him thoroughly, and they were able to essentially rule him out. or they couldn't put charges on him at least. Another situation came up where a serial killer named Scott Lee Kimball would tell police that someone had confessed to him about killing Thomas. However, Scott Lee Kimball would turn out to be lying because, why would you trust a serial killer anyway? Unfortunately, there really was no physical evidence left behind at the scene. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they left no shoe impressions behind. They left no fingerprints, no DNA. They didn't even enter the house. They shot at him from outside the house. They knew exactly where he would be, right here at his computer desk. So they also believe that this was clearly a targeted attack. They just couldn't figure out who. I mean, think about it, he prosecuted a lot of people, and any one of them could have been a suspect. In 2018, the FBI would announce that they believed that this was done by a single shooter. However, they believe that this shooter was hired to do this. This was a hired hit. The FBI also announced that they believe that this occurred, or it was orchestrated as a conspiracy by some small group of people. However, it still has not helped them identify who the shooter is, and they have not announced publicly the name of this particular group, or if they even know the name, if they have any suspects or persons of interest. This guy may not even be the killer. This may have just been a guy who was running down the street around the same time. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Thomas Wales in terms of who organized this, who wanted him dead. Well, I'm sure a lot of people did. Was it related to his gun control advocacy? He was extremely vocal about it. Given his, role as a prosecutor, his voice may have mattered to people that may have gotten things done. And maybe someone who's against gun control advocacy wanted to silence him, or could have nothing to do with that. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the murder of Thomas Wales, please contact the FBI office, specifically in Seattle, Washington. You can reach them at 206-622-0460. This is one of the most disturbing videos I've ever seen, given the context of it. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Tita family. Viewer discretion is advised. This is going to be a long video, closing in on 10 minutes, so just a heads up. It was Christmas time in 1990. The Tita family had this winter cabin which they would go to for holidays, and it was in Weber County, Utah. The family would name it the Tita's Tranquility. It was a place for peacefulness and family and joy. But unfortunately, it would soon become a horror story. 20-year-old Lene and her 16-year-old Trish Tita were incredibly excited for Christmas that year. They were excited to be spending the festivities at their cabin, and they would be doing so with their mother, Kay Tidwell Tita, their father, Rolf, and their grandmother, Beth Tidwell Potts. That afternoon, the family went out to do some Christmas shopping, and while they were out, they had no idea that there were two men inside their home. Now, the family was in two different vehicles, and so Lene, Beth, and Kay came back to the cabin first. They got home sometime around 3:30 p.m. As they walked deeper into the home, suddenly a man appeared from behind the refrigerator. It was this man here, a man named Von Lester Taylor, and he pointed a gun at the women. And then a second man emerged holding a gun, Edward Stephen Deli. And without any hesitation, without any warning, they shot Beth and Kay directly in their heads, killing them both instantly. Lene just witnessed her mother and grandmother get gunned down by two strange men who just appeared from the shadows in their cabin. And she was terrified what was about to come next. Not only is she possibly going to die here, but her father and her sister still haven't gotten home. And then she sees them pull up to the driveway. The two men notice and go outside and point guns at her sister and her father and take them hostage. They put a gun to Rolf's head and fired twice, and it misfired. But then a third shot went off and he was hit directly in his face. And then the two men poured gasoline all over his body and lit him on fire. They then set other parts of the house on fire as well. Now, luckily, the home did not go up in flames. The fire seemed to go out kind of on its own. The two men then forced the sisters to load up on the snowmobiles that the family had, and at gunpoint made them basically drive away with them. Now, a neighbor, had heard the gunshots go off, and they had already called 911. As they're fleeing on these snowmobiles with these two men, they actually see their uncle wave at them on the road. But to spare his life, because they were afraid if they try to get help from him, that these two strange men would kill him too. So they completely ignored their uncle. But then the uncle sees someone else flying by on another snowmobile. It was the girl's father, Rolf, face covered in blood. He stops for his brother and says, "My daughters have been kidnapped, my wife has been killed, and my mother-in-law has been killed." It's unbelievable that he survived being shot in the head and set on fire. Later, we found out that he struggled getting outside to the snow where he would roll around to put out the flames, because he got onto that snowmobile and took off after his daughters, basically almost nude in the freezing cold weather. Now, the two men with the two kidnapped teenage girls, they find a spot or get to a car, so they get off the snowmobiles and load up into a car with the girl still being held hostage. And at that point, Rolf and his brother catch up with them in the car, and they begin to pursue them at 90 miles an hour. And this is actually a rare situation. They actually had a car phone, and they were also calling the sheriff's department as they're pursuing these murderers and kidnappers. And it works, because the craziness of this chase causes them driving the car to swerve off the road. And eventually the car comes to a complete stop and gets stuck in the snow, and there's nowhere for the two men to go. The sheriff's department arrives really quickly after this. And at that point, the sheriff's department is able to apprehend both men. The two girls are rescued, and thanks a lot in part, or a huge part, to their father, who had been shot in the head and was set on fire. He still managed to get himself free and onto a snowmobile to chase after them. Back at the home, the police find an absolutely bloody scene. They find both women dead. They do find bloody shoe impressions. There's these massive pools of blood in other parts of the house. They see a house that's completely in disarray. They find out the way they entered the home was through the garage. To give you some example of how cold it was, I'm not exactly sure how the blood got onto the deck, but there was a pool of blood on their outside deck, and it began to drip below. It was so cold that the blood, this is an actual photo, the blood froze into bloody icicles. And unfortunately, they had two deceased women inside the home, killed so brazenly by these two men. They had no care in the world that they just killed these two women. As a matter of fact, they would find out later that one of the men, pretty much the ringleader, Von Lester, had called someone earlier that day, and he told the friend, "I just want to shoot some people today. I want to kill someone." Well, later on, when they are arrested, they basically state that there was no intent to kill anyone. Except the family knew, and the police knew that both of the men had been in the house before the family got home. And then there was the videotape that they found. This is a 1-minute portion of that tape.
I don't know. Okay. I don't think I got all of this.
Your light flashing on the room that.
I don't know. How am I supposed to find out?
And my man.
What is it?
Baseball card.
Okay. Let's see a couple of them.
On the football and basketball.
Show them this way. Show them this way.
The two men, and this is Von Lester, casually sat in that house and opened up all of the Christmas presents under the tree and recorded themselves with the Tita family video camera. Present after present after present, knowing full well at this point that a family lives there and that they're probably just out and that they're going to be home at any point. Coupled with the fact that his friend said that he just wanted to shoot and kill someone today, this was a premeditated murder. They were waiting for a family to come home so that they could kill them. And to see this video of this guy just opening presents and the other guy just casually going, "I don't know," it is so disturbing. It's just, an incredibly haunting visual to see. So, both men are obviously arrested and they're charged with numerous charges, including first-degree murder. Von Lester Taylor pretty much knows that the jig is up with him, that there's no doubt that he's going to be convicted, and so he just ends up pleading guilty to both murders. Von Lester Taylor, to my knowledge, is actually still awaiting his execution. Daly decided to go to trial, and he pled not guilty. And at the end of that trial, he was found guilty of second-degree murder, and because of that, they can't do the death penalty for it. So he would end up being sentenced to life in prison without parole. Several years later, Rolf Tita would end up passing away from cancer. But he is the absolute unsung hero of this entire story. He was shot in the face, lit on fire, and he still managed to get aboard a snowmobile and chase after his daughters to save them. And he did. He saved them. He prevented those two girls from being murdered and God knows what else. The two girls have obviously grown up to have their own families, and while it's something that they'll never forget, it is something they have chosen not to let dictate their life. They would end up later on rebuilding the cabin because it had gotten a lot of damage from the fire, and it still remains in the family to this day. And the memory of their mother and grandmother and their father will live on forever. The TikTok ban here in the US, or the increasing likelihood of the TikTok ban here. I'm filming this on January 14th in the morning, so this is before the Supreme Court has announced any ruling. But you know who it sucks for the most, in my opinion? The true crime community. And I don't mean pages like mine necessarily. I'm talking about pages from victims' loved ones. I'm talking about Maura Murray's sister. I'm talking about Grant and Gracie Solomon's mom, Angie. Stephanie Wassilishin's daughter. Justice for Dennis Wusenhoff, Dennis's family. Eric Neelam's family. Layla Santanello's mom. Etc., etc., etc. These are family members who are trying to either find their missing loved one or get justice for their murdered loved one. These are people who have literally... The only reason their loved ones' stories are known is because of TikTok. And a lot of these creators have built up large followings. Some of them have tens of thousands, some of them have hundreds of thousands, some of them have over 1 million. And all of that goes away for them. All of it does. All the work they've put into to get justice for their loved one or find their loved one, gone. All of that incredible traction they have gotten, all of that support, gone. And now most of them are going to have to start from scratch again. And it's not easy to build large followings on places like YouTube or Instagram. It's probably easier to gain that kind of traction and to go viral primarily here on TikTok. It's I don't know, it's just so... It's shitty. I would highly encourage you to go to every single page that you follow that is from a family member of a murdered or missing loved one. Go to their profiles, find out if they have other socials like YouTube, Instagram, Blue Sky, X, Facebook, whatever the case may be, and follow them on all of those apps. Whatever apps you have, follow them on all of those places. Help boost their stories if they're posted on other platforms. Help boost their stories, share their videos, share their content, give all of their stuff likes. And then you do have the true crime pages like mine and many, many others where it's about primarily trying to find and help these families get justice for their loved ones. And there are a lot of true crime creators who maybe don't have any connection to any victim that have been instrumental in, say, certain stories being amplified, going viral, as it were. Those, murdered or missing people who never had their stories told, suddenly many people know their story, which means more eyes on that story, which means the right person might see those videos and go, oh my God, I know something. All of that, gone. It sucks. It really does. And I wish these fucking politicians and these Supreme Court justices would actually look at things like this and go, wow, this is what so many people are going to be losing as well. Not only are people losing their incomes, 170 million people are losing their part of their rights to free speech here, but millions of people earn an income to support themselves or their family off of here, including and especially people whose small businesses literally depend on TikTok. That goes away for them. Their entire source of income, gone. I won't be saying any kind of goodbye until the fucking whistle blows. I'm going down with the ship. I mean, obviously follow me on all the other socials, YouTube, that kind of thing, all my link tree in the bio. But keep pushing out those stories, because your pages may not be gone. You may not be able to do anything with them, but perhaps those stories will still be out there. So keep putting them out there on TikTok, because there's a good chance that people will still see them outside the US. But to all of those pages who have dedicated to their missing or murdered loved one, I'm sorry. Comment below your page if you do, and people who see this video, go to those pages, subscribe to all their other socials. Follow them here on TikTok, just in case. Let's try to do anything we can to make sure that their stories and their voices are not silenced. He went for a walk outside of his hotel and has never been seen since. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tyler Davis. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Tyler Davis was married to Brittany Davis, and they had a 1-year-old son. They lived in Wilmington, Ohio. Tyler worked as a restaurant manager, and he was an incredibly loving father. He was very devoted to his son, and he would never in a million years ever leave him. To celebrate Brittany's 23rd birthday, the two of them would go down to Columbus, Ohio, where they would have booked to stay at a Hilton hotel. They had made some plans to do some shopping and go eat at some nice restaurants. And they had invited, several friends to come, but only really one of the friends actually ended up arriving there. They had checked into the Hilton Hotel at approximately 5 p.m. on February 23rd, 2019. A friend of Tyler's, who I guess lived in the Columbus area, would end up going to the hotel to meet them. They were just hanging out in the hotel room, reminiscing, and they decided, let's go out and have some dinner, maybe get a couple drinks. And that's what they did. This is some CCTV footage of them leaving one of the restaurants or the bars, and it was around 3 o'clock in the morning when they got themselves an Uber to take them back to the hotel. I guess on the way back to the hotel, both Tyler and his friend passed out in the Uber, and when they arrived at the hotel and woke up, Brittany says that Tyler seemed very confused and almost a little agitated, like he didn't know where he was. And when they were dropped off, he had told Brittany, I'm going to go take a walk just, a little around the hotel. She offered to go with him, but he said he wanted to go alone. And then his friend got out of the Uber and told Brittany, I'll go with him just to make sure he's okay. A short time after this, Tyler, using a cell phone, would call Brittany's cell phone to say, hey, I'll be right back. But then something strange happens. Shortly after that phone call, Tyler's friend gets back to the hotel room, but Tyler is not with him. He explains to Brittany that he is fine. He'll be back here in just a few minutes. Tyler just, needed some air. And then at 4:10 a.m., with the friend in the hotel room with Brittany, her cell phone gets another call from Tyler. And he basically told her, I'm walking through the woods. I can see the hotel. I'll be right there. Then a few seconds after that phone call ends, she gets another call from Tyler's cell phone, but this time there is nobody on the other end of the line. It's just dead. And then the call drops, and that's it. That's the last time his cell phone ever calls her. Brittany would say that, Tyler was not an outdoorsman, that he could look at two trees next to each other and say, that's the woods. But he did sound confused when she did hear his voice. Later, it would be found out that Tyler's cell phone was basically powered off after that last call went through that dropped, and his cell phone has never been turned on again. Meanwhile, Tyler's friend leaves the hotel room around 5 or so in the morning to go back to his home. Brittany's panicking. She has no idea where Tyler is. She herself is walking around the hotel. She's walking around outside, seeing if she can find him. She's not having any luck. Then she calls an old friend of theirs who lived in Columbus to, can you please help me come find Tyler? The friend comes out there. At this time, it's getting closer to 9 or 10 in the morning, but they don't find him. She then calls Tyler's parents. And then at about 10:30 a.m., they report Tyler missing. Once the authorities get involved, they're able to pull up some of his cell phone data, and they can see where all these little yellow pins are. They tracked his movements with his cell phone. They also found footage of him walking away from the hotel around the time when Brittany and the friend said that this occurred. There's more footage of him walking through a parking lot, but essentially this is pretty much the last known image of Tyler. And then he's just gone forever. Police brought in helicopters, they brought in search dogs, they brought in expert divers to search the nearby bodies of water, and they thoroughly searched. I mean, they went all in on looking for him. He was not anywhere. If he fell into the water and drowned, they would have found him, but they didn't. They searched the surrounding, wooded areas around the hotel. They didn't find him. His cell phone has never been found. He was just there one night, and then he was gone forever, leaving behind his 1-year-old son, which everyone in his life said there is no way he would ever willingly do that. They just don't know if Tyler met with foul play or if an accident happened. But if an accident occurred, where the heck is he? Unfortunately, because social media sucks at times, and because the true crime community certainly can be incredibly toxic, full of a bunch of, know-it-alls, Brittany was dragged through the mud, basically, by these types of people. Without any actual evidence or proof or anything, she was vilified. I don't know about the friend. I don't know what his story is and what exactly, connects him to what happened, because all I know is that the friend was in the hotel room with Brittany when Tyler had called twice. So she knows he was alive then, with the friend with her. So it doesn't sound like he had anything to do with it. But, police have stated that Brittany, she's not a suspect in this. They can confirm her whereabouts. They know what her movements were. But again, the online world can be extremely cruel and accuse people of things before the facts or information ever comes out. What's most important here is that Tyler, a husband and a father, is missing. Certainly, it could have been some kind of accidental death. Maybe he died from hypothermia. It was very, very cold. But certainly, if that happened, you would have found him. So that's the biggest mystery is how come they haven't found him if this was an accidental thing. His bank account, his social security number never been used, so it's not like he ran away. He's never been seen or spotted ever since. It really makes you question if foul play was involved, but what that was is a mystery. And that's where this case really ends, as a mystery. They don't know where he is, they don't know what happened to him. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth, if this was foul play. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Tyler Davis or what occurred that particular night, please call 614-645-4545. A young Indigenous man was seen here at this hotel back in 2020, but he has not been seen since. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Willis Darendoff. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Willis Darendoff was a 34-year-old man who was originally from Huslia in Alaska. Willis was of the Koyukon Athabascan people. Willis, pictured here with his dad, was a very talented musician. He played the guitar. He also plays drums. He plays the violin. He was described as a born musician, and he also sang too. Willis was a good guy, very well respected. He was kind and caring, and he loved his family. In October of 2020, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, he had been doing some seasonal work, and after that was done, he traveled to Fairbanks, Alaska, and he checked into this Extended Stay America hotel, which was in Fairbanks on Old Airport Road. On November 9th, 2020, he spoke to his mom on the phone. The call was at 6 o'clock in the morning. He told his mom he was actually planning to go get a COVID test because he wasn't feeling well. He also told her that I guess he had broken his cell phone and lost his ID, so he's going to be spending that day trying to replace those items as well. At that same time, Willis's father and sister were also in Fairbanks, Alaska, and on that day in November 2020, they go to visit him at the hotel, but when they knock on his door, he doesn't answer. The hotel staff said they saw him there that morning, but he wasn't apparently answering his door. On November 10th, 2020, a friend can confirm that they saw Willis at the hotel in his room. However, the friend wasn't allowed in the room. Willis basically cracked open the door and said he was with a girl and that the friend couldn't come in. And then later that same day, Willis was spotted at Wright's Air Service, a commuter airline, I guess. Then he was spotted at the Fred Meyer grocery store. These are reported sightings, are not confirmed sightings. But ever since that November 10th, 2020 day, nobody has seen Willis ever again. His family, once they were unable to contact him or reach him and he wasn't answering his door at the hotel, they reported him missing. November 11th, 2020, when he was officially reported missing, witnesses would report seeing him at Stone Soup Cafe on November 11th, and that was on Gaffney Road in downtown Fairbanks. November 12th, 2020, there would be other witnesses who stated they saw him on that day, November 12th. They stated that they saw him at the extended stay hotel with a tall Alaskan native man. This man had a thick mustache, and he was wearing a black Carhartt jacket with like a silver trim. Again, it's not a confirmed sighting, it's just reportedly. And this is 2 days after his family reports him missing. When Willis was last seen a confirmed sighting, he was wearing a black leather jacket, red sleeper fleece pants, and a beanie. His mother Gladys has since traveled to Fairbanks very soon after he was reported missing to begin searching for him. His siblings and the rest of his family became involved, searching for him. Despite the pandemic kind of in its core, they all came together to look for him. They conducted several searches through wooded areas, and his mom and family would spend the next 8 months searching that entire area for Willis, but unfortunately they never found any sign of him. Tragically, his father passed away in 2021. He never found out what happened to his son or where he was. That same year, the family would hire a private investigator to see if they could uncover anything, but there was no luck. And to this day, the whereabouts of Willis remain unknown. What happened to him remains unknown. They don't know if foul play was involved or not. He is still just labeled as missing. Willis has black hair with brown eyes. He is approximately 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighs approximately 160 pounds at the time of his disappearance. He has a tattoo on the side of one of his hands, and it's a tattoo that says the name Tracy, and on the other hand, a tattoo that says RJW. He also has a tattoo of a saying, "Sometimes quiet is violent," and that's on his forearm. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know what happened to Willis, and perhaps that someone is you. His family deserves answers. They deserve to bring him home. Hopefully alive, but if not, they deserve to lay him to rest. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Willis, please call 907-269-5511 or 970-450-6500. The case number is AK200865992. You can report information anonymously. If you know anything, please come forward. She would go for her daily jog down this road, but this time, she never got home. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Winifred Teo. Viewer discretion is advised. Winifred Teo was born in 1967. She was one of 3 kids. She grew up in a really loving home. Her parents would give the kids basically anything they needed. They got great educations, and she was living in Singapore with her parents. At the time this case occurred, she's attending Catholic Junior College, and she is 18 years old. She was described as an absolutely model student. She was a perfect student. She got amazing grades. She was really intelligent, super smart, had a very bright future ahead of her. She was very outgoing and very friendly. She was always doing like physical activities. She was very athletic. And she would participate and be a counselor for, adventure camps is what they call them out there. Now, they lived near the, I might say this wrong, the Bukit Batok Nature Park in Singapore. And this is the park where she would do her jogs almost every day. And that's exactly what she was doing on the evening of May 22nd, 1985. Her usual jog would take her down Old Holland Road, and many witnesses saw her jogging that night as they had seen her jogging there many times prior. And she was not being followed by anyone that anyone could recall seeing, and she seemed like she was in her normal spirits. But again, Winifred on this particular night never came home. She left her home that night at about 6 p.m. She should have been home after a few hours, but once she didn't get there, her mom had waited just a couple more hours just in case, and then finally reported her missing. Winifred's dad was actually on a business trip in Germany, and once he found out, he basically got on the next flight and flew back home. And it wouldn't take long to find her. 6 hours after she was reported missing, Winifred's body was found. She was nude, and she was just thrown in some overgrowth. She was about 4 or 5 meters away from the road where she typically jogged. Her hands had been tied with her own t-shirt, Her shoes, her shorts, and her watch had been found in a different location nearby. Her body was covered in mud and she was bruised all over. And they do believe that she was sexually assaulted. However, do they have DNA from that? I'm not positive. Her cause of death were 6 stab wounds directly to her neck. This was a very brutal attack. Now, none of her belongings were stolen. I mean, her watch was found nearby. It's not like she really probably had cash on her anyway, but they don't know if the motive was an attempted robbery, if the motive was sexual assault. They don't know if this was just something. There was like a rumor that, her dad had business dealings and this was some sort of revenge thing against her father, but they never found any proof of that. More than likely, it sounds like this was just probably someone who was stalking people as they were jogging, and maybe he saw her every day, and finally he decided to do something. But unfortunately, they don't know. From that point moving forward, girls in that area were basically told by police to only move about in groups of 2 or 3 people. Don't ever walk anywhere alone. Students at her school and the other schools nearby were petrified. Police did interview as many people as they could find that were at the park that night. They interviewed her close friends, her schoolmates, her family, and they could not come up with any viable suspects, not even a person of interest. There were inklings that this may have been a part of a serial murder because I guess sometime later another young woman was found in the same park dead, but her cause of death was completely different than what happened to Winifred. And so ultimately, police do not believe the 2 murders are actually connected at all, and that Winifred's murder was a one-and-done kind of thing. The murder weapon, they searched that park extensively. That murder weapon was never found. There were no witnesses, at least none that have come forward, to say they heard or saw anything. It was relatively crowded that point of night, not super busy, but there were people there at the park. So this person managed to get her off the road without making a sound. Unless people did hear or see something but don't want to say anything. Years go by and there's just no updates. They have no evidence to link to anyone. It sounds like they're really going to be relying on somebody coming forward. I know in 2021 the case got some new attention from like a cold case unit, but that has not produced anything new at this time. And so the sexual assault and murder of 18-year-old Winifred Teo remains unsolved. I know some countries have different statute of limitations on murder, but Singapore is not one of them, meaning that there is no statute of limitations. So the killer can still be brought to justice at any point. So if somebody knows something, you've got to tell police. I can't guarantee how it works there in Singapore, like in terms of being anonymous. Like here in the States, you can report anonymously and not to say your name, but still provide the tip. I'm sure you can do that there too. But if you know anything, you have got to come forward. I know it's been decades, but that doesn't mean she doesn't deserve justice. Her killer might be out there still. He may have hurt more people. He may hurt more people in the future, even if he's an older man now. So if you know anything, please do the right thing and come forward and tell police what you know and help Winifred and her family get the justice she rightfully deserves.